tonight you will find yourself in another place, another time. The air is softer here. The pace is slower, and the world moves without urgency, without noise, without interruption. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. You can simply observe and let each moment pass as gently as it arrives. If you find this kind of quiet storytelling helpful, please subscribe and return whenever you need a moment of rest. You can always try one of the other videos. If you'd like the story to continue while you sleep, you can set the video to loop. Now take a slow breath and let the world around you begin to fade as you drift into the quiet rhythm of history. But before we go anywhere, take a moment, get settled, and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever you are in the world tonight, drop a comment below telling me your location and your local time. I read every single one, and there is something genuinely lovely about knowing this story is reaching people in quiet rooms on opposite sides of the planet. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes and imagine a hillside so green it almost hurts. The kind of green that comes from altitude and rainfall and volcanic soil working together in a combination so precise and so generous that the plants practically grow themselves. You are standing in the highlands of southwestern Ethiopia in a region called Kaffa, and the air here is cool and damp and carries something in it. A faint, sweet, almost fruity smell that you cannot quite name. The trees around you are not the manicured, pruned bushes of a modern plantation. They are older than that, wilder than that, growing the way things grow when no human has told them not to, sprawling and shaded and thick with leaves, their branches heavy with small, round, bright red fruits that glow in the morning light like tiny lanterns. These are coffee cherries, and right now, in this forest, in this moment, the history of the world's most consumed psychoactive substance, drunk by approximately 2 billion people every single day, is waiting to begin. The highlands of Ethiopia's Kaffa region sit at elevations between roughly 4,000 and 7,500 feet above sea level, which is high enough to produce the cool nights and warm days that Coffea arabica, the plant responsible for the vast majority of the world's finest coffee, absolutely adores. The soil here is dark and rich and slightly acidic, built from centuries of decomposed forest matter and the slow weathering of the basalt and volcanic rock that underlies much of the Ethiopian plateau. The rainfall is reliable and generous, coming in distinct seasons that give the coffee plants a natural rhythm of growth, rest, flowering, and fruiting. And crucially, the forest canopy provides a natural shade that moderates the temperature and slows the ripening of the coffee cherries in a way that concentrates their sugars and complexity. Wild coffee trees in these forests do not look like the waist-high, neatly spaced bushes of a Kenyan plantation or a Brazilian estate. Left entirely to themselves, they grow into trees of 10, 12, sometimes 20 feet. Their trunks developing a modest girth over decades, their canopies spreading wide and generous. On these trees, the coffee cherries develop slowly over a period of 6 to 8 months from the white star-shaped flowers, which smell powerfully, almost overwhelmingly, of jasmine, to the deep red or yellow fruit that signals ripeness. Inside each cherry, typically nestled face to face like two sleeping siblings, are the coffee seeds. The seeds that we call beans, though they are not beans in any botanical sense, they are seeds, seeds of a fruit. And the fruit, if you bite into a ripe one, is startlingly sweet, tasting of something like hibiscus and watermelon and brown sugar. Nothing like the dark, bitter intensity of the drink made from the seed inside. This is the thing that surprises most people when they first encounter coffee in its raw, unroasted form. It does not smell or taste like coffee at all. A raw green coffee bean is dense and waxy, slightly grassy with almost no aroma. The coffee flavor, that entire complex world of caramel and chocolate and fruit and smoke and earth that we associate with the drink, does not exist yet. It has to be created. It has to be made. And the making of it involves a transformation so complete that the end product bears essentially no chemical resemblance to the beginning, which is either extraordinary or deeply suspicious depending on your philosophical disposition. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The fruit is still on the tree. The year is somewhere around the 9th century AD, give or take a century or two. And somewhere in this forest, a goat herd is about to notice something. His name, in the most popular version of the story, is Kaldi. He is young, a boy perhaps, or a young man, and he tends his goats in these highlands in the way that people have tended animals in highlands since before history bothered to write anything down. The goats, as goats always do, are going wherever they please and eating whatever interests them. And on this particular day, what interests them is a shrub with bright red berries that Kaldi has not paid much attention to before. He notices that after eating the berries, his goats do not come home at sunset the way they usually do. They are still out, hours after dark, not sleeping, not settling, leaping and frisking with an energy that seems entirely unrelated to their previous behavior. They are, in the word most often used to describe them, dancing. Kaldi, being a reasonably curious person with time on his hands and a professional obligation to understand what his goats are doing, tries the berries himself. He feels, shortly after, a quality of alertness and vitality that he finds remarkable. He brings the berries to a nearby monastery. The monks, being cautious men with theological opinions about unexpected stimulation, throw the berries into a fire. And then, the pivotal moment. The fire releases a smell, a deep, warm, extraordinary smell that fills the room and causes everyone present to stop what they are doing and pay attention. The roasted berries are pulled from the embers. Hot water is added. The first cup of coffee is poured. It is a beautiful story, and it has the virtue of being internally consistent and emotionally satisfying, which is everything you want from an origin myth. Whether it is literally true is a different question entirely. The legend was first written down in 1671 AD by a scholar named Antoine Faustus Nyron, which places the story's documentation roughly 8 centuries after the events it describes, which is the kind of gap that tends to make historians reach for their caveats. What historians do agree on is this: coffee originated in Ethiopia. The Coffea arabica plant is native to the Ethiopian highlands. The word coffee almost certainly derives from Kaffa, the name of the region. and the tradition of coffee drinking began in Ethiopia, where the plant grew wild and the people who lived among it eventually worked out that something interesting was happening inside those red cherries. You probably won't survive drinking coffee the way the earliest Ethiopians did, which involved mashing the raw beans with fat and eating the paste as a stimulant, a practice that bears about as much resemblance to a flat white as a fistful of raw wheat bears to a croissant. The drink came later, the sophistication came later, but the energy was always there, packed into the seed, waiting. The coffee plant did not stay in its Ethiopian forest. It had too much going for it, too much useful chemistry, too much appeal to the humans who encountered it, to remain a local secret for long. The mechanism of its spread was not dramatic or sudden. It was the slow, patient movement of useful things through trade networks and religious communities, and the word-of-mouth recommendations of people who had tried something and wanted others to try it too. It began with a journey across water. The Red Sea, at its narrowest point between what is now Eritrea on the African side and Yemen on the Arabian side, is roughly 18 miles wide. 18 miles is not much. It is the kind of distance that can be crossed in a few hours on a clear day with a reasonable boat and a following wind, and people had been crossing it for trade and migration for thousands of years before coffee entered the picture. When Yemeni traders operating in the Ethiopian highlands, buying and selling goods in that network of commerce that connected the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, encountered coffee, or when Ethiopian traders brought their goods across the water to the markets of Yemen, the coffee plant, and the knowledge of its effects, made the crossing with them. The exact timing is uncertain. The first credible written evidence of coffee being brewed and consumed as a beverage places the event in 15th century Yemen, in the Sufi monasteries of that mountainous country. The Sufis are a mystical tradition within Islam, practitioners of a spiritual path that emphasizes direct personal experience of the divine through meditation, prayer, music, and ecstatic ritual. Their nighttime practices, the long hours of devotional prayer, and the recitation of religious formulas called dhikr, sometimes lasting through the entire night, created a specific and practical need for a substance that would maintain alertness and concentration through those dark hours, without the moral complications of alcohol, which Islam prohibits. Coffee was the answer. A manuscript by the Islamic scholar Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, written in the 16th century, describes Sufi groups in Yemen consuming coffee from a large vessel of red clay, with their leader ladling it out to each member of the group as they passed it to the right, maintaining their prayers through the night on its gentle chemical assistance. This is the first documented coffee ritual, and it has a quality that every coffee drinker today would recognize. The gathering of people around the beverage, the social dimension of sharing it, the way it marks a particular kind of time, focused, communal, purposeful. The Sufis were not simply fueling their prayers. They were creating, perhaps without knowing it, the first version of what would become one of humanity's most universal social forms. From the Sufi monasteries, coffee moved into the wider society of Yemen with a speed that suggests the population was not difficult to convince. By the middle of the 15th century, it was being consumed in the homes and markets of Yemeni cities, and by the early 16th century, it had made the journey to Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, where millions of pilgrims from across the entire Muslim world arrived each year, encountered coffee, and carried the habit home with them when they left. This was, in commercial terms, the most efficient distribution network imaginable. A substance that became popular in Mecca would spread to every corner of the Islamic world within a generation, carried in the minds and habits of returning pilgrims. Within a few decades of its arrival in Mecca, coffee had reached Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and then, inevitably, Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire and one of the most important cities on earth. Yemen's role in this expansion was not merely passive. The port city of Al-Muqa, known in the West as Mocha, which is why that word has been associated with coffee ever since, and why a chocolate-flavored coffee drink carries the name of a Yemeni port city that most people serving it could not locate on a map, was the commercial center of the early global coffee trade. For nearly 2 centuries, Yemen maintained what amounted to a monopoly on coffee production and export, guarding it with the kind of commercial protectiveness that made perfect sense. Here was a product the entire Muslim world wanted, growing in your mountains, and the income from it was considerable. Yemeni authorities took steps to ensure that no viable coffee seeds or plants left the country, roasting or boiling any seeds intended for export so they could not be propagated elsewhere. They did not succeed indefinitely. We will get to that. But for a remarkably long time, if you wanted coffee, you needed Yemen. The Ottoman Empire absorbed Yemen into its territory in the early 16th century, which meant that the coffee trade became part of the vast Ottoman commercial network, and coffee began spreading through the empire's cities with extraordinary velocity. The 2 Syrian merchants who opened the first documented coffee house in Istanbul in 1554 or 1555, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, whose architectural and cultural legacy the Ottoman capital still displays today, set in motion something that would, within decades, fundamentally reshape the social life of every city in the empire. These establishments were called kahvehane in Turkish, kahvekhane in Arabic, coffee house, and they were something genuinely new in the world. Before coffee houses existed, the primary social spaces available to the ordinary men of Ottoman cities were the mosque, the marketplace, and the home. Each of these had its own constraints. The mosque was sacred, the marketplace was commercial, the home was private. The coffee house was none of these things. It was a public space where any man, regardless of social rank, profession, or religious status, could sit for the price of a cup of coffee and stay as long as he liked. He could talk, listen, argue, play chess or backgammon, hear storytellers and musicians read, write letters, conduct business, circulate gossip, and gather political opinions. He could, in short, do what humans do when you give them a warm, comfortable room, an energizing beverage, and permission to stay. By the end of the 16th century, Istanbul alone had over 600 coffee houses. By the beginning of the 19th century, that number had grown to approximately 2,500 establishments, serving a city of around 400,000 people. That works out to roughly 1 coffee house for every 160 residents, which is either a remarkable density of social infrastructure or simply an honest reflection of how much the Ottoman population wanted somewhere comfortable to sit and talk. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman coffee house was primarily a social institution, a place for community formation and shared leisure, or primarily a political one, a space where the absence of official oversight allowed dissent and opposition to organize. The answer was almost certainly both, which is why authorities periodically attempted to close them and found it essentially impossible. A government that tries to shut down the place where its citizens go to socialize is taking on more than it can manage. The controversy over coffee in the Islamic world had its own fascinating arc. Almost from the moment it became popular, coffee attracted theological opposition. In 1511, just a few years after coffee appeared in Mecca, conservative religious scholars convened a court that declared coffee forbidden, citing its stimulating effects as analogous to wine. The ban was overturned within a few years by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman, who was not inclined to tell his subjects they could not have their coffee. The argument made by coffee's defenders was elegant. The Quran prohibits intoxication, and coffee does not intoxicate. It wakes you up. Prohibition of the wakeful is a much harder theological case to make than prohibition of the drunk, and it eventually failed, though not before producing centuries of intermittent controversy that reflected real tensions between religious conservatism and the irresistible social momentum of the beverage. Murad IV, the Ottoman Sultan who ruled from 1623 to 1640, took the opposition to an extreme level. He banned both coffee and coffeehouses entirely, made violations punishable by death, and is said to have personally patrolled Istanbul's streets in disguise to catch offenders. Whether the death penalty was actually applied consistently is disputed, but the ban's effectiveness was not. Istanbul's coffeehouse culture was too deeply embedded in the city's social fabric to be extracted by decree, and the coffeehouses largely continued operating with the practiced discretion of institutions that have outlasted harsher oppositions than a sultan's irritation. Coffee reached Persia through the Safavid Empire in the 16th century, where it entered a civilization with its own rich intellectual and social traditions and was absorbed into them. In Isfahan and Tabriz, coffeehouses became gathering places for poets, philosophers, and scholars, developing a character slightly different from the Ottoman version. More literary, perhaps, more inclined toward philosophical discussion. The Persian word for coffee house, kahve-khane, described spaces that were often more elaborately decorated than their Ottoman equivalents, with painted tile walls and gardens and musicians and spaces designed for the specific pleasure of sitting and thinking. What all of these early coffee cultures shared, across their geographic and cultural differences, was the understanding that coffee was inseparable from conversation. You did not drink coffee alone in the sense that even if you were physically alone, you were drinking it in a social context, in a coffee house, among others, as part of a communal practice. The beverage and the gathering reinforced each other. Coffee made conversation livelier, sharper, more prolonged. Conversation gave coffee a reason to be consumed, slowly and repeatedly. Together they created a kind of social chemistry that would prove irresistible everywhere it traveled. And it was about to travel further than even the most ambitious Yemeni coffee merchant could have imagined. Across a different sea, into a different civilization, where a young Venetian merchant was about to take his first sip of something he had never tasted before. Venice in the mid-16th century was the most cosmopolitan city in Europe, and it was cosmopolitan in the specific way that port cities become cosmopolitan, not through an ideological commitment to openness, but through the relentless practical reality of commerce. Ships came into the Venetian lagoon from Constantinople, Alexandria, Beirut, and Lisbon, carrying goods from every civilization the Mediterranean touched. And the merchants who unloaded those ships brought with them not just cargo, but habits, tastes, and knowledge of the world beyond the Alps. If any European city was going to encounter coffee first, it was always going to be Venice, because Venice was where the Ottoman trade routes met the European appetite for novelty. The first documented appearance of coffee in Europe places it in Venice around 1570, arriving through the trading networks that connected the Venetian merchants to their Ottoman counterparts in Constantinople and the Levant. European travelers who had spent time in Ottoman cities had been writing about the strange, dark beverage for some years before this. The diplomat Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, serving as the Holy Roman Empire's ambassador to Constantinople in the 1550s, described coffee in letters home, noting that the Turks drank it frequently and found it sustaining. These accounts filtered back to Europe and created a low-level awareness of the drink before it physically arrived, so that when it did appear on Venetian quaysides, it was not entirely unknown, merely novel. Early European reactions to coffee were mixed in ways that now seem comic but were entirely logical at the time. Coffee was dark, which, to minds schooled in the visual symbolism of medieval Europe, suggested something potentially sinister. It was bitter, which was unfamiliar. European palates trained on wine and ale and sweetened confections found the flavor confronting. It was stimulating in a way that had no obvious European equivalent, producing an alertness that was not intoxicating, but was distinctly not ordinary either. And it came from the Islamic world, which gave certain European religious figures grounds for theological suspicion. The story goes that some Catholic clergy in Italy petitioned Pope Clement VIII to ban coffee as an infidel beverage, and that the Pope, after tasting it, instead gave it his approval, allegedly remarking that it would be a shame to let the devil have something this delicious all to himself. Whether this exchange happened exactly as described is uncertain, but the papal blessing, real or apocryphal, opened the way for coffee to become respectable in Catholic Europe. The first European coffeehouse opened in Venice in 1645, which means that roughly a century passed between coffee's arrival in Europe and the establishment of the social institution that would carry it into mass adoption. That century was not wasted. It was a period during which coffee was consumed primarily by the wealthy and well-traveled, sold by street vendors and apothecaries, and regarded as a medicine as much as a pleasure. The apothecary framing was important. By positioning coffee as a health substance with therapeutic properties, early European vendors could charge premium prices and attach a respectable scientific legitimacy to what was, at its core, a very enjoyable drug. From Venice, coffee moved northward and westward with the general momentum of trade. It reached England not through the Catholic South, but through the Protestant merchant networks of the Levant Company, which maintained trading operations in the Ottoman cities and whose members had developed a taste for coffee during their time abroad. The first English coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650, established by a Lebanese man named Jacob, and was called the Angel. 2 years later, in 1652, a coffee house opened in London, also established by a man from the Levant, a Greek named Pasqua Rosé, who had come to England as the servant of a British merchant and had observed correctly that his employer's English friends were fascinated by the coffee he prepared. Rosé set up a stall in St. Michael's Alley in the city of London and began selling coffee to the public, producing a handbill describing its properties that read like a combination of medical textbook and enthusiastic sales pitch. Good for headaches, good for the eyes, good for the stomach, useful against drowsiness, effective for a cold. Essentially claiming that coffee could treat almost everything short of a missing limb. London's coffeehouse culture expanded with a speed that reflected both genuine demand and a social moment in which the existing options for public sociability, primarily the tavern and the alehouse, were identified with drunkenness and disorder in ways that made a sober alternative politically and commercially attractive. By 1663, there were approximately 83 coffee houses in the city of London alone. By the end of the century, estimates put the number in the hundreds. These were not quiet, genteel spaces. They were dense, noisy, smoke-filled rooms, crowded with men. It was almost exclusively men in the early period, sitting at long shared tables, reading newspapers aloud, arguing about politics, conducting business, spreading gossip, and absorbing the energizing effects of strong, freshly brewed coffee in the specific way that people absorb stimulants in sociable environments. Loudly, the English coffee houses earned the nickname penny universities because for the price of a penny, which bought you a cup of coffee and admission to the room, you had access to every newspaper the establishment took, every conversation happening around you, and the accumulated commercial and political intelligence of whatever class of merchant or professional happened to use that particular house. Different coffee houses developed different clienteles based on their location and the professions of their regular customers. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley was frequented by stockbrokers and traders, and eventually became the London Stock Exchange. Lloyd's Coffee House, operated by Edward Lloyd near the Thames, was favored by maritime merchants and ship captains, and the marine insurance market that grew from the conversations held there became Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market that still operates today. The Will's Coffee House in Covent Garden attracted writers and poets, including John Dryden, who held a regular table there, and became a center of literary discussion that shaped English letters during the Restoration period. The coffee house as an institution was democratic in a specific, limited, historically unprecedented way. It was not truly democratic. Women were excluded, the poor could not afford the penny, and social hierarchies persisted inside the room as surely as outside it. But the principle that any man who could pay for his coffee could sit at any table and participate in any conversation was genuinely radical by the standards of 17th century Europe, where most social spaces were strictly segregated by rank, profession, or religion. The coffee house dissolved some of these distinctions, not all of them, not permanently, but enough that contemporaries noticed and commented on it. The historian Matthew Green has noted that prior to the arrival of coffee and coffee houses, most people in England were either slightly or very drunk for most of their waking hours, and that the arrival of a sober, stimulating beverage and the social space that hosted it created a kind of collective clarity that contributed to the intellectual and commercial explosion of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. France acquired its coffee houses somewhat later, but adopted them with considerable style. The Café de Procope, which opened in Paris in 1686 and still operates today, making it one of the oldest restaurants in the world, attracted a clientele that included Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and the other philosophers of the French Enlightenment who gathered there to argue about reason, liberty, and the proper organization of human society over cups of strong coffee. Historians still argue whether the coffee houses of Paris and London were genuinely instrumental in the political revolutions that followed. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the broader intellectual transformation of the 18th century, or whether the connection between coffee culture and Enlightenment thinking is a correlation rather than a cause. What is harder to dispute is that the coffee houses provided a physical infrastructure for exactly the kind of dense, rapid, cross-class intellectual exchange that new political ideas required to develop and spread. The conversations that happened in them mattered, whether or not the coffee itself deserves the credit. Meanwhile, in Vienna, coffee was arriving through a different channel and with a story attached that, whether or not it is entirely accurate, is too good to abandon. When the Ottoman army besieged Vienna in 1683 and was eventually repelled, they left behind, among their other equipment, substantial quantities of coffee beans. A Polish officer named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had served as an interpreter and spy during the siege, claimed the abandoned beans as part of his reward and used them to open Vienna's first coffee house. Whether the beans were truly abandoned or whether Kulczycki obtained them some other way, what is certain is that the Viennese cafe culture that developed from this period became one of the most distinctive and enduring coffee cultures in the world. Slower, more contemplative, and more focused on the pleasure of sitting for long hours with a newspaper and a beautifully presented cup than the rowdy English coffeehouse model. The Viennese cafe, where you could sit for an entire afternoon over a single melange without anyone looking at you with impatience, is a direct descendant of that post-siege tradition. Coffee, in the space of roughly 2 centuries, had traveled from an Ethiopian forest to the intellectual salons of Paris, the commercial hub of London, and the elegant cafes of Vienna. It had been condemned as diabolical and approved as papal. It had been drunk by Sufi mystics in the dark and by English stockbrokers in the noisy light of afternoon. It had survived bans and skepticism and bad early European attempts at preparation, and it was about to begin the next phase of its journey. The phase that would take it out of the old world and into the new one and transform it from a regional commodity into the global force it is today. The beans were waiting, the boats were almost ready, and somewhere on a tropical island in the Caribbean, soil was waiting that would change everything. The Yemeni coffee monopoly was, in retrospect, always going to end. Monopolies on desirable agricultural products have a historical tendency to dissolve under the pressure of human ingenuity, commercial motivation, and the specific determination of people who have decided they want something and are not prepared to keep paying someone else's price for it indefinitely. The Arabs knew this, which is why they parboiled or roasted the coffee seeds they exported, heat treatment that prevented germination, ensuring that no viable plant could be grown from purchased beans outside Yemen's borders. For a remarkably long time, this strategy worked. For nearly 2 centuries, Yemen was the sole commercial source of coffee in the world, and the port of Mocha was the only place you could reliably buy it in quantity. The first significant breach came from the Dutch, who had demonstrated in the tea trade that they were not the kind of commercial operation to accept a monopoly held by someone else without making serious efforts to circumvent it. Dutch traders in Yemen managed, sometime around 1616, to obtain live coffee plants. Exactly how is not documented with precision, which suggests the acquisition was not entirely above board, and brought them to the Netherlands, where they were cultivated in greenhouses at the Botanical Garden in Amsterdam. These plants were the biological foundation of what would become a global empire of coffee cultivation, because the Dutch East India Company, which already controlled extensive colonial territory in Southeast Asia, had both the land and the organizational capacity to grow coffee at scale outside Arabia for the first time. Coffee cultivation began in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, around 1658, and then in Java, the large Indonesian island that was the heart of the VOC's Asian operations from around 1699. Javanese coffee proved extraordinarily successful. The combination of volcanic soil, tropical humidity, and altitude in Java's highland regions produced a coffee of distinctive character, heavy-bodied, somewhat earthy, less acidic than the Yemeni original, that found an eager market in Europe. The word Java became so synonymous with coffee in English that it persists as slang to this day, which is a small but genuine linguistic monument to the Dutch colonial enterprise and its agricultural consequences. The Dutch had broken Yemen's monopoly, and the age of plantation coffee had begun. From Java, the story of coffee's global cultivation travels through one of the more remarkable acts of botanical espionage in history. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam presented Louis XIV of France with a gift of a coffee plant, which was placed in the royal greenhouse at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and tended with the attention that rare and valuable things received in royal collections. This single plant, known as the noble tree, would become the progenitor of most of the coffee grown in the Americas today, a genealogical line of descent that runs from a Yemeni mountain through an Amsterdam greenhouse, through a French royal garden, through the Caribbean, and into the cup in your hand if your coffee comes from Latin America, which statistically it probably does. The man responsible for taking the noble tree's offspring across the Atlantic was a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieux, and his story is either an inspiring example of dedication to an agricultural mission or a cautionary tale about obsession, depending on how you read it. In 1720, de Clieux obtained a cutting or seedling from the plant in Paris. The exact method of acquisition is, again, diplomatically vague in the historical record, and boarded a ship to Martinique in the French Caribbean. The journey was not straightforward. By various accounts, the ship was attacked by a Tunisian corsair. There was a violent storm. A fellow passenger, motivated by what de Clieux later described as jealousy or malice, attempted to sabotage the precious plant, and during a period of calm, when the ship ran low on water, de Clieux reportedly shared his own daily water ration with the seedling, going thirsty himself to keep the plant alive. Whether every detail of this account is accurate, de Clieux wrote it up himself decades later, which is the kind of source that historians handle carefully. The seedling did arrive in Martinique, and it did survive, and it was planted in the soil of the Caribbean with results that exceeded any reasonable expectation. From that single plant, within 50 years, there were approximately 18,600 coffee trees growing on Martinique. By 1788, the island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, just across the water, was supplying approximately half of all the coffee consumed in the entire world. A single cutting carried across the Atlantic in a glass case by a man who went thirsty to water it had become the foundation of a hemisphere's agricultural industry. Brazil's entry into coffee production is its own story of audacity and seduction in roughly equal measure. In 1727, a Brazilian military officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent to French Guiana on a diplomatic mission, ostensibly to help mediate a border dispute between the French and the Dutch colonial territories, but actually, according to the historical record's strong implication, with the additional objective of obtaining coffee seeds. The French, protective of their Caribbean coffee monopoly, were not inclined to share. Paleta, however, charmed the wife of the French governor of Cayenne to such an extent that when he departed, she presented him with a bouquet of flowers in which she had concealed fertile coffee seeds. Whether this was a romantic gesture, a commercial bribe, or a diplomatic accommodation by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing, remains one of coffee history's more entertaining, unresolved questions. The seeds Paleta brought back to Pará in northern Brazil were planted, and within a century the consequences of that bouquet had become the dominant force in global coffee production. Brazil's southeastern states, Minas Gerais, São Paulo, Espírito Santo, and the surrounding regions, offered a combination of climate, land area, and labor supply that allowed coffee cultivation to expand on a scale impossible anywhere else. By the 1830s, coffee had become Brazil's largest export commodity, accounting for 30% of global production. By the 1840s, Brazil had become the world's largest coffee producer. By the 1920s, Brazil held approximately 80% of the global market, a near monopoly that exceeded anything Yemen had managed at the peak of its own dominance. The early Brazilian coffee economy was built on slavery in a way that cannot be separated from its commercial success. Between the early 19th century and the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888, approximately 1.5 million enslaved Africans were brought to work on Brazilian coffee plantations, and the brutal conditions of plantation labor were integral to the economics that made Brazilian coffee so competitively priced. This is not a footnote to the history of coffee. It is one of its central facts, and the cup of coffee that fueled the intellectual discussions of European Enlightenment salons was purchased with money that depended many steps down the supply chain on the coerced labor of enslaved people on the other side of the Atlantic. The commodity and its human costs traveled together, even if the consumers who drank it preferred not to examine the connection. Vietnam's emergence as a major producer came from a completely different historical trajectory. French colonial authorities introduced coffee cultivation to Vietnam in 1857, initially planting Arabica in the northern highlands. After the devastation of the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese government invested heavily in coffee production in the central highlands, primarily planting Coffea canephora robusta, which thrives in Vietnam's lower altitude conditions and produces a bean with higher caffeine content, lower acidity, and a bolder, more earthen flavor than Arabica. The results were dramatic. Vietnam went from negligible global production in the 1970s to becoming the world's second largest coffee producer today, responsible for approximately 20% of global output, almost entirely in Robusta beans that go into instant coffee, espresso blends, and the Vietnamese iced coffee tradition of strong Robusta brewed through a small metal filter over sweetened condensed milk, a drink of considerable intensity and charm that has nothing to do with European coffeehouse culture and everything to do with Vietnamese agricultural and culinary ingenuity. Colombia, the world's third largest producer, developed its coffee industry in the mountainous Andes through a model fundamentally different from Brazil's plantation system. Small family farms of 2 to 5 acres, growing primarily Arabica at high altitudes in the dramatic topography of the Colombian Coffee Triangle, a region of steep hillsides and rich volcanic soil where the combination of altitude, 2 growing seasons per year, and hand-picking of only the ripest cherries produces a coffee of consistent, mild, bright quality that became the standard for what Western consumers understood as good coffee for most of the 20th century. The fictional character of Juan Valdez, introduced in 1958 by the Colombian Coffee Federation to market Colombian coffee internationally, became one of the most successful agricultural branding exercises in commercial history. A mustachioed farmer and his mule, embodying the image of careful, traditional, family-scale production, and convinced an entire generation of coffee drinkers to look for the label. Coffee's global spread from that single Ethiopian forest to cultivation in over 70 countries across 4 continents had taken approximately 500 years from the first documented brewing to the establishment of the modern industry. It had involved legends and love affairs, wars and weather, plants carried in glass cases across oceans and seeds hidden in bouquets. And through all of it, the coffee plant itself had simply continued doing what it had always done, flowering in white jasmine-scented blooms, setting fruit, ripening its cherries from green to yellow to red, and waiting patiently for someone to notice that the seed inside was worth the trouble. The trouble, it turned out, was considerable, and it was only just beginning. You are standing at the edge of a coffee farm in the highlands of Colombia or Ethiopia or Guatemala. It does not matter which exactly, because what is about to happen happens in all of them at altitude, in the cool of the early morning, with mist in the valleys and dew on the leaves and the smell of something green and alive all around you. The harvest has begun. The trees are heavy with ripe cherries, clusters of them hanging from the branches in dense, jewel-like rows, each one a deep arterial red that catches the low morning light. You reach out and touch one. It is smooth and firm, yielding slightly under your fingertip, warm despite the chill in the air from being in the sun since first light. You pull it gently from the branch. It comes free with almost no resistance when it is properly ripe, separating cleanly, and roll it in your palm. This small, round, unremarkable-looking fruit is the beginning of everything. The coffee cherry is deceptively complex in its structure, given how simple it looks from the outside. Working inward from the smooth outer skin, called the exocarp, you encounter first a layer of pulp, which is the sweet, mucilaginous fruit flesh that tastes of hibiscus and watermelon and is actually quite delicious raw. Beneath the pulp is a layer of sticky mucilage that clings to the seeds inside with considerable tenacity. Beneath the mucilage is a thin, papery layer called parchment, the endocarp. And inside the parchment, pressed face to face in their little chamber, are usually 2 seeds, each covered in a delicate membrane called the silver skin. These seeds, once removed from all their protective layers and dried and roasted, are what you grind and brew. Every other layer is, from the coffee drinker's perspective, something to get through. Though increasingly, as the specialty coffee world has expanded, the pulp and mucilage are being recognized as having their own value. Cascara, a tea-like beverage made from the dried coffee cherry skins, has been consumed in Yemen for centuries and is now finding curious new audiences in Western specialty cafes. There are 2 primary species of coffee that account for the overwhelming majority of what is commercially produced and consumed. Coffea arabica represents somewhere between 60 and 70% of global production and is responsible for virtually all of the world's finest coffees. It grows best at elevations between roughly 1,800 and 6,600 feet above sea level in the cool, misty conditions of tropical highlands, with temperatures between approximately 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a delicate plant, susceptible to disease, sensitive to frost, requiring specific conditions that limit where it can be successfully grown. But it produces a seed with a flavor complexity, fruity, floral, bright, sweet, with acidity that can range from the gentle warmth of a well-made caramel to the sharp, clean brightness of citrus that Robusta cannot match. Coffea canephora, Robusta, is everything its name suggests, robust. It grows at lower altitudes, tolerates higher temperatures, resists disease more successfully, and produces higher yields per tree. Its beans contain roughly twice the caffeine of Arabica, which the plant uses as an insecticide to repel pests, which is a piece of chemistry worth sitting with for a moment. The coffee that wakes you up every morning is, from the plant's perspective, a pest deterrent that you've been cheerfully consuming for centuries. Robusta's flavor is bolder and earthier than Arabica, with less of the delicate fruit and floral complexity, and a bitterness that espresso blenders use deliberately for crema, the thick, reddish-brown foam that sits atop a properly pulled espresso shot. And instant coffee manufacturers value for its consistent, intense flavor that survives the industrial processes of mass production. The harvest of coffee is almost entirely done by hand on quality-focused farms, and this is not a romantic preference but a practical necessity. Coffee cherries on a single branch do not all ripen at the same time. They ripen sequentially over a period of weeks, moving from green to yellow to red, or yellow to deep gold in yellow-fruited varieties, at their own individual pace. A machine that strips all the cherries from a branch at once will collect ripe, underripe, and overripe fruit together, mixing quality levels in a way that damages the final cup. Only a human hand, moving through the rows with the specific attention of someone who's been taught what ripe looks like and has spent seasons developing the tactile sensitivity to feel the difference, can reliably pick only the cherries that are ready. On the finest farms, pickers work to a standard called selective picking, taking only the cherries that have reached the perfect stage of ripeness and leaving everything else on the branch to be harvested in subsequent passes over the following weeks. A skilled picker working at a selective standard might cover a daily harvest of somewhere between 100 and 200 pounds of coffee cherry, which sounds impressive until you work out that it takes approximately 2,000 hand-picked cherries to produce 1 pound of finished roasted coffee, meaning that a good day's picking might yield enough cherry for perhaps 100 to 150 pounds of finished product. On large Brazilian farms, where the relatively flat terrain and the economic structure of the industry make it viable, mechanical harvesters, devices that straddle the tree rows and use vibrating rods to shake ripe cherries loose, handle much of the harvest. But for the high-altitude, steeply terraced farms of Ethiopia, Colombia, Yemen, and most specialty-producing regions, there is no substitute for the human hand. After picking, the cherries must be processed quickly. The soft fruit begins to deteriorate within hours of harvest, and delay means fermentation of the wrong kind, which damages quality. This urgency creates a rhythm on harvest farms that is less like ordinary agricultural work and more like a continuous, time-sensitive operation, with fresh cherry arriving from the fields throughout the day and the processing operation running continuously to keep pace. The processing of coffee, the removal of all those layers between the cherry's skin and the green seed inside, and the drying of that seed to the stable moisture level of approximately 12%, at which it can be safely stored and shipped, is where some of the most significant decisions about the final flavor of the coffee are made. 3 primary methods dominate global production, and each produces a fundamentally different cup from the same raw material. The oldest method is the natural process, sometimes called dry processing, and it is both the simplest and the most demanding in terms of attention. After picking, the whole cherries, skin, pulp, mucilage, parchment, and seed, all intact, are spread in thin layers on raised drying beds or concrete patios to dry in the sun. They stay there for anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, raked and turned regularly to ensure even drying and prevent the formation of mold. During this time, the fruit sugars in the pulp and mucilage slowly ferment and migrate into the seed, infusing it with a fruity sweetness that gives naturally processed coffees their characteristic flavor. Richly sweet with pronounced fruit notes, blueberry, strawberry, tropical fruit, a heavier body, and a lingering sweetness in the finish. Natural processing is the method used for most coffee in Ethiopia and much of Brazil, and it produces the kind of cup that people who are accustomed to clean, bright-washed coffees sometimes find overwhelming, too fruity, too wine-like, too much, and that people who love it find irreplaceable. The washed process, or wet processing, takes the opposite approach. Immediately after picking, the cherries are pulped, their skin and most of their fruit flesh removed mechanically, and the seeds, still covered in mucilage, are placed in fermentation tanks filled with water. For 12 to 72 hours, Naturally occurring bacteria and yeasts break down the remaining mucilage, loosening it from the parchment. The seeds are then thoroughly washed with clean water to remove every trace of fruit and spread on drying beds to dry. The result is a coffee that is clean, bright, and transparent in its flavor, with the origin characteristics of the bean, its terroir, if you will, expressed with great clarity because there is no layer of fruit fermentation sitting between you and the character of the seed itself. The acidity is higher and more precise. The body is lighter, and the flavors tend toward the floral and citrus end of the spectrum. Most Colombian, Kenyan, and Central American specialty coffees are washed, and the clean, jewel-like clarity of a well-made Ethiopian yirgacheffe washed coffee, bergamot and jasmine, and something that tastes almost exactly like Earl Grey tea in a cup of coffee, is one of the most arresting flavor experiences available from a plant. The honey process occupies the middle ground, leaving some or all of the mucilage on the seed during drying to produce a cup that is sweeter and more full-bodied than a washed coffee, but cleaner and less fermented than a natural. The name comes from the sticky, honey-like mucilage that coats the beans during drying, and the color of that mucilage, yellow honey, red honey, black honey, depending on how much is left and how long the drying takes, is used to classify the result. Historians still argue whether the honey process was first developed in Costa Rica or Brazil, and producers in both countries maintain their own version of this origin story with considerable conviction. Once dried to the target moisture level, the coffee, still enclosed in its parchment layer, is stored in carefully controlled conditions until it is ready for milling. The milling step removes the parchment and the silver skin, grades the beans by size and density, and sorts out defects, broken beans, discolored beans, beans with insect damage, either by machine or, in the most quality-focused operations, by hand. The final product is green coffee, dense and waxy, and grass-scented, ready for export in 60-kilogram jute burlap sacks that are the universal unit of the global coffee trade. From the farm to the bag, the coffee has been touched by dozens of hands, subjected to days or weeks of carefully managed natural processes, tested and graded and evaluated by experienced assessors. It has not yet become anything like the drink you are going to make from it. That final transformation requires fire. A green coffee bean is not an inviting object. Hold one in your palm, and you have something that looks like a small, flattened pebble. Dense, slightly waxy, pale gray-green in color, with a curved central crease called the center cut running down its flat face. Smell it, and you get very little. A faint grassiness, perhaps a slight vegetable note. Nothing that suggests what is about to happen. Put it in your mouth and you will find it so hard that you risk a tooth, with a flavor that is raw and starchy and vaguely unpleasant. There is nothing about a green coffee bean in its raw state that explains why billions of people organize their mornings around a drink made from it. Everything changes with heat. The process of roasting coffee is, at its most fundamental level, an act of controlled destruction and creation happening simultaneously. The heat drives moisture out of the bean. Green coffee starts at around 60 to 70% water by weight, and finished roasted coffee sits at around 1 to 3%, while simultaneously triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that build complexity from simplicity, transforming the raw materials of the green bean into something with over 1,000 distinct aromatic compounds compared to the few dozen present before roasting. The fire does not simply cook the coffee, it invents it. The journey of a coffee bean through a roaster follows a temperature curve that roasters spend years learning to read and control. In the early stages, from room temperature up to about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, the bean is absorbing heat and drying out, its color shifting from pale green to yellow as chlorophyll breaks down and early chemical reactions begin. The smell at this stage is grassy and slightly vegetal, not unpleasant, but not yet recognizable as coffee. The beans are endothermic in this phase, meaning they are absorbing heat from their environment rather than producing it, and the roaster has to supply consistent energy to keep the temperature curve climbing. Around 300 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, the Maillard reaction begins in earnest. This is the same chemical process responsible for the browning of bread crusts, the searing of meat, the caramelization of onions, a reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars under heat that produces a cascade of new molecules, including the melanoidins that give roasted coffee its brown color and the hundreds of volatile aromatic compounds that give it its smell. The Maillard reaction in coffee produces notes of caramel, chocolate, nuts, toffee, bread, and an almost endless variety of more specific flavors, depending on the precise temperature, the timing, the origin characteristics of the bean, and the airflow inside the roaster drum. It is, in the most literal sense, the creation of flavor from raw ingredients, a kind of culinary alchemy that professional roasters study with the same seriousness that winemakers bring to fermentation. Somewhere between 385 and 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the beans reach a milestone that roasters call the first crack. The moisture inside the bean has turned to steam. The pressure has built to a point that the bean's cell structure can no longer contain it, and the bean expands and fractures along its center cut with an audible pop. A sound like a very quiet, very rapid series of small explosions, something between popcorn and distant applause. First crack signals the beginning of what roasters call the development phase, the period during which the final flavor character of the roast is established. A roaster who ends the process shortly after first crack will produce a light roast, bright, acidic, with the origin characteristics of the bean clearly expressed, floral or fruity or tea-like, depending on the variety and processing. A roaster who continues heating will produce progressively darker results, the flavor shifting from bright and complex toward deeper, rounder, more caramelized territory. At around 435 to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, a second crack occurs, quieter than the first, more continuous, a soft crackling sound as the bean's cell structure breaks down further and oils begin migrating to the surface. Roasts taken to second crack and beyond are dark roasts, full city plus, Vienna, French, Italian. The beans are dark brown to nearly black, their surfaces slick with oils, their flavor profiles dominated by bittersweet chocolate, smoke, and roasty intensity. The origin characteristics, those specific regional flavors that distinguish an Ethiopian yirgacheffe from a Colombian huila, are largely burned away by this point, which is why dark roasts all tend to taste somewhat similar, and why specialty coffee enthusiasts who specifically want to taste where the bean came from tend to prefer lighter roasts. Dark roasts were historically popular partly because they masked the defects and staleness of lower quality beans. If everything tastes like smoke and char, you cannot easily detect the off flavors underneath. The contrapositive of this fact led to one of the coffee world's persistent myths that dark roasts contain more caffeine than light roasts. They do not. Caffeine is extremely stable under roasting temperatures and barely changes between a light and a dark roast. What does change is bean density. Dark roasted beans are less dense than light roasted beans because more mass has been driven off as gas and vapor during the longer roasting process. This means that if you measure your coffee by volume, spoonfuls, a dark roast will have slightly less caffeine per cup than a light roast because you are putting slightly less coffee by weight into each spoon. If you measure by weight, as serious coffee makers do, the difference is minimal. The person who switches to dark roast hoping for a stronger caffeine hit has been misled by marketing, which is a very common fate and nothing to be embarrassed about. Once the beans reach the target roast level, they are rapidly cooled, either by releasing them onto a cooling tray where a fan draws ambient air through the beans, or by a water quench in industrial operations, though the latter is controversial because it adds moisture back to the bean and affects flavor. The cooling must be rapid because the beans continue roasting from their own internal heat, even after they leave the drum. A phenomenon called carryover cooking that the roaster has to account for by pulling the batch slightly before the target color and temperature, knowing the beans will coast the rest of the way during cooling. Getting this timing right is part of the skill that separates a competent roaster from an excellent one. After cooling, the roasted beans enter what is called the degassing phase, a period of anywhere from 12 hours to several days during which they release carbon dioxide, a byproduct of the Maillard reaction from their cell structure. This is why quality coffee bags have a one-way valve on them. The little circular button on the side of a specialty coffee bag that you can press to smell the coffee inside, which allows carbon dioxide to escape without letting oxygen in. Fresh roasted coffee releases so much carbon dioxide that if you sealed it in an airtight bag immediately, the bag would inflate like a small balloon and potentially burst. The degassing period is also why very fresh roasted coffee within the first 12 to 24 hours after roasting does not make the best cup. Too much carbon dioxide in the brew interferes with extraction, producing a slightly sour, gassy result. Most roasters recommend waiting at least 24 hours after roasting before brewing, and consider the window of peak flavor to run from roughly 2 days to about 4 weeks after the roast date for most coffees. The grinding of roasted coffee before brewing is itself a significant variable because the size of the coffee particle determines how quickly water extracts the soluble compounds inside. Grind too coarse and the water flows through quickly without dissolving enough, producing a thin, sour, underdeveloped cup. Grind too fine and the water struggles to pass through, extracting too much and including the bitter, astringent compounds that over-extraction produces. The correct grind size depends on the brewing method. French press requires a coarse grind. Espresso requires an extremely fine one pour-over sits in between. And the freshness of the grind matters enormously. Coffee begins losing volatile aromatic compounds within minutes of being ground, which is why pre-ground coffee, regardless of its quality before grinding, delivers a noticeably flatter result than freshly ground beans. Historians still argue whether the invention of the domestic burr grinder did more for coffee quality than any other single consumer technology, and the argument has some merit. The transformation from green seed to roasted, ground, brewed cup is a chain of decisions: processing method, roast profile, grind size, brew ratio, water temperature, extraction time, each one capable of elevating or degrading the final result, each one representing centuries of accumulated knowledge and experimentation. The cup of coffee at the end of this chain is not simply an agricultural product. It is the output of a craft, applied at every stage, from the farmer who decided when to pick to the person who decided how long to steep. And what is in that cup, from a chemical perspective, is one of the most complex substances a human being can put in their mouth. Pick up the cup. Hold it for a moment before you drink. The steam rising from it carries somewhere between 800 and 1,000 distinct volatile aromatic compounds, which is a number that bears repeating. Somewhere between 800 and 1,000. Wine, which has a reputation for complexity that fills entire libraries of tasting notes and enological scholarship, contains perhaps 800 aromatic compounds. Coffee matches or exceeds it, which is one reason why the specialty coffee world has borrowed the vocabulary of wine so extensively, talking about terroir, about varietals, about the specific flavor notes of specific growing regions, because the conceptual framework of wine is one of the few existing languages sophisticated enough to describe what is actually in a cup of well-made coffee. The most famous of coffee's chemical constituents is caffeine, chemically known as trimethylxanthine, which sounds like something you would need a laboratory to produce, but which the coffee plant manufactures in its leaves and seeds, with the casual efficiency of a process refined over millions of years of evolutionary pressure. The plant uses caffeine as a natural insecticide, concentrating it in the tissues most vulnerable to pest damage, the young leaves and seeds, where it is toxic to insects at the doses the insects would encounter in chewing through the plant. This means that the stimulant you rely on for your morning alertness is, from the plant's perspective, a weapon system. You are drinking bug repellent and finding it delicious. This is, if you think about it, one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the human relationship with the natural world. In the human brain, caffeine works through a mechanism of elegant simplicity with surprisingly complex downstream effects. As your brain burns energy throughout the day, thinking, perceiving, moving, existing, it produces a byproduct called adenosine, a chemical that accumulates in neural tissue and binds to specific receptors in the brain to produce the sensation of drowsiness. This is a functional system. As you use energy, adenosine builds up, you feel progressively more tired, eventually you sleep, adenosine clears, and you wake refreshed. Caffeine's molecular structure is similar enough to adenosine's that it fits into the adenosine receptor, like a key that fits a lock but does not turn it, blocking adenosine from binding without triggering the drowsiness response. The adenosine is still there, still accumulating, but it cannot deliver its message because caffeine is sitting in the seat it needs. You feel alert, not because caffeine is adding energy to the system, but because it is blocking the signal that tells you the energy is running low. The downstream effects of this receptor blockade are where things become more interesting. With adenosine's inhibitory influence removed, Dopamine and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters associated with motivation, focus, and mood, operate with greater freedom, which is why caffeine produces not just wakefulness, but a quality of engaged alertness, a willingness to direct attention that is qualitatively different from simply being not asleep. The dopamine dimension of caffeine's effects is part of why coffee is genuinely pleasurable in a way that goes beyond the flavor. You are triggering a mild but real reward response in the brain's motivational circuits, which is also part of why regular coffee drinkers find going without it difficult in a way that has both physiological and psychological dimensions. The catch, of course, is that the adenosine does not disappear during the hours you have been blocking it. It has been accumulating the whole time, patient and persistent, waiting. When the caffeine eventually clears your system, with a half-life of roughly 5 to 7 hours, meaning that half the caffeine from a morning cup is still in your system early afternoon, the adenosine floods the now unblocked receptors all at once, producing what regular coffee drinkers know as the crash. A sudden, sometimes steep, drop in alertness and mood that arrives not because you are more tired than you would have been without coffee, but because the tiredness that caffeine deferred has arrived at once rather than gradually. The crash is not a side effect of caffeine exactly. It is the debt of the deferral coming due. Regular coffee consumption leads the brain to adapt by upregulating adenosine receptors, creating more of them essentially to compensate for the fact that so many are being chronically blocked. This is the physiological basis of caffeine tolerance. Over time, you need more coffee to achieve the same alertness effect because you have more receptors for the caffeine to block. It is also the mechanism behind caffeine withdrawal headaches. When a regular coffee drinker stops abruptly, they suddenly have far more adenosine receptors than normal, all of them unblocked, producing a flood of adenosine signaling that manifests as fatigue, headache, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. These symptoms typically peak at 24 to 48 hours and resolve within a week, which is cold comfort to the person experiencing them, but at least represents a finite timeline. Beyond caffeine, coffee contains a remarkable array of other physiologically active compounds. Chlorogenic acids, a group of polyphenols particularly abundant in coffee, have been the subject of extensive research into their antioxidant properties and their potential effects on metabolic health, inflammation, and glucose regulation. Coffee is, somewhat surprisingly, one of the largest sources of antioxidants in the average Western diet, not because it has the highest concentration of antioxidants per gram, but because people drink so much of it that the cumulative intake is substantial. Epidemiological studies have consistently found associations between regular moderate coffee consumption, typically defined as 2 to 5 cups per day, and reduced risk of several chronic conditions, including type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, certain liver conditions, and some forms of depression. The research on coffee and Parkinson's disease is particularly striking. Multiple large-scale epidemiological studies have found that regular coffee drinkers have a significantly lower risk of developing Parkinson's, a neurodegenerative condition characterized by the progressive loss of dopamine-producing neurons, compared to non-drinkers, with the protective effect appearing to be dose-dependent up to a point. The mechanisms are not fully understood, and the association does not prove causation, but the consistency of the finding across different populations and study designs is strong enough that neurologists take it seriously. Whether caffeine's effects on dopamine signaling are responsible, or whether other compounds in coffee contribute, or whether there is some confounding factor not yet identified, remains an active area of scientific inquiry. The picture is not uniformly positive because very few things are. High caffeine intake, typically defined as more than about 400 milligrams per day, or roughly 4 to 5 cups of strong coffee, is associated with increased anxiety in people with anxiety disorders, disrupted sleep if consumed too late in the day, elevated heart rate and blood pressure in sensitive individuals, and, in pregnancy, potential risks to fetal development at high doses. The relationship between coffee and cardiovascular health is nuanced. Moderate consumption appears to be neutral or mildly beneficial in most healthy people, while very high consumption may increase risk for certain arrhythmias in susceptible individuals. Coffee is not a medicine, and treating it as one, drinking 12 cups a day, because the research says 2 to 5 is associated with health benefits, will not produce proportionally better health outcomes and will almost certainly produce a level of anxiety and sleeplessness that offsets any benefit. The flavor complexity of brewed coffee comes from those hundreds of volatile compounds interacting in the cup and in the nose, because the majority of what we experience as flavor is actually retronasal olfaction, the perception of aroma molecules traveling up from the back of the mouth to the olfactory receptors during swallowing. When you sip coffee, you are tasting a relatively small palette of primary tastes: bitter, sweet, sour, perhaps a little salt and umami depending on the water. But you are smelling an enormously complex chemical orchestra. This is why hot coffee smells more intense than cold coffee. Volatile compounds evaporate more readily at higher temperatures. And why a cold brew, which is extracted with cold water over many hours, produces a different flavor profile from hot brewed coffee, even using the same beans and grind. Different compounds extract at different temperatures, and cold water selectively draws out certain flavor components while leaving others behind, producing the smooth, low-acid, chocolatey character that cold brew fans pursue specifically. The water itself matters in ways that are not immediately obvious to anyone who has not encountered the chemistry. Coffee is approximately 98.5% water. The other 1.5% is the dissolved solids from the coffee, which means the character of the water has a direct effect on the final result. Water that is too soft, with very low mineral content, extracts coffee poorly and produces a flat, underpowered cup. Water that is too hard, with high calcium and magnesium carbonate content, can produce a chalky, hollow flavor and over time scale deposits in your brewing equipment. The ideal water for brewing coffee has moderate mineral content. The Specialty Coffee Association recommends a total dissolved solids level of around 150 milligrams per liter, which is softer than most British tap water but harder than distilled water, and a temperature of around 195 to 205 degrees Fahrenheit, just below boiling. The perfect cup of coffee, in other words, requires the right bean, the right roast, the right grind, the right water, the right temperature, the right ratio, and the right time. It is a chain of dependent variables, each one capable of salvaging or destroying the work of all the others. And the fact that most people make a perfectly adequate cup without thinking about any of this at all is either a testament to how forgiving the process actually is, or to how low most people's standards have become. A question on which the specialty coffee community has strong and frequently expressed opinions. What is not in question is the sensation of drinking a well-made cup. The warmth spreading from throat to chest, the immediate brightening of attention, the complex flavor unfolding through its stages as the cup cools slightly and the volatile compounds change in their relative proportions. There is a reason this drink conquered the world. There are, technically speaking, about 1,000 reasons, and they are all floating in the steam above your cup right now. There is a country in Northern Europe where the sun disappears for most of winter, where the temperature drops to levels that make the concept of going outside a genuine philosophical commitment, and where the people have responded to these conditions by developing one of the most thorough and deeply embedded coffee cultures on Earth. Finland consumes approximately 12 kilograms of coffee per person per year, which works out to roughly 4 cups per day for every man, woman, and child in the country, including the ones too young to drink it, which means that the adults are drinking considerably more than 4 cups per day and seem entirely unconcerned about this. Finland has been the world's largest per capita coffee consumer for decades, and it holds this distinction with the quiet confidence of a nation that has found something that works and sees no reason to change. Finnish coffee culture is not primarily about espresso or specialty brewing or the pursuit of exotic single-origin beans from remote microclimates. It is about filter coffee, simple, honest, strong, black, served in a large cup and refilled without ceremony as many times as necessary. Finnish labor law codifies 2 coffee breaks per working day, called kahvitauko, as a legal entitlement for employees, which is either the most sensible piece of workplace legislation in the industrialized world or a very effective lobbying achievement by the coffee industry, depending on your political philosophy. Helsinki reportedly has more coffee shops per capita than any other city on earth, and the Finnish relationship with the drink has the quality of something that has moved beyond preference into something approaching constitutional necessity. Norway sits in second place with approximately 9.9 kilograms per person per year, followed closely by Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, all of which maintain the Nordic pattern of high volume, simple preparation, culturally embedded coffee consumption. In Sweden, the concept of fika, a dedicated break for coffee and something sweet, taken socially with colleagues or friends, and considered not a luxury but a social obligation, has achieved the status of a national institution. To skip fika is to opt out of a social contract. To offer fika to a guest is to extend genuine hospitality. The word does not translate neatly into English, which is itself telling. Languages develop specific vocabulary for the things their cultures consider important, and Swedish needed a specific word for the ritual coffee break because the ritual itself is specific and non-negotiable. The reasons for Nordic coffee dominance are multiple and interlocking. The climate is the most frequently cited factor, and it is a real one. Hot beverages are simply more appealing in cold and dark environments, and Finland and Norway experience both in quantities that make warmth something to be actively pursued rather than taken for granted. But climate alone does not explain the specific depth of Nordic coffee culture, because plenty of cold countries have not developed the same intensity of relationship with the beverage. Historical factors matter too. In the 19th century, the Nordic governments imposed heavy taxes on alcohol, making it expensive and socially regulated in ways that redirected the demand for sociable drinks toward coffee. By the time alcohol became more freely available, coffee was already so deeply embedded in Nordic social fabric that it retained its central position, regardless of competition. The Netherlands, which sits at approximately 8.4 kilograms per person per year, has a coffee culture shaped by its historical role as the nation that broke Yemen's monopoly and established the first non-Arabian coffee plantations. The Dutch relationship with coffee has a commercial depth that reflects centuries of intimate involvement with the commodity. The country remains one of the world's most significant coffee trading and processing hubs, with Rotterdam as one of the major entry ports for global coffee trade. Austria, at around 5.5 kilograms per person per year, maintains the contemplative cafe culture that developed from the post-Vienna siege tradition. The elegant Kaffeehäuser of Vienna, with their marble tables and bentwood chairs and newspapers on wooden holders, represent a coffee culture deliberately oriented toward leisure and intellectual life in a way that the Nordic filter coffee tradition is not. You do not rush a coffee in a Viennese cafe. The entire point is that you do not rush. Italy, which occupies a fascinating position in the global coffee hierarchy, is not actually among the top per capita consumers by weight. Italian consumption runs at around 4.5 to 5 kilograms per person per year, moderate by European standards. What Italy lacks in volume, it compensates for in cultural influence that is entirely disproportionate to its consumption statistics. The espresso system, the method of forcing hot water at high pressure through a compact puck of finely ground coffee to produce a small concentrated shot with a surface layer of emulsified oils called crema, was developed in Italy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it became the dominant model for commercial coffee preparation worldwide in a way that no other national coffee tradition has managed. The first espresso machine was patented in 1884 by Angelo Moriondo of Turin, though the modern pressurized espresso system as we know it was developed and refined by Luigi Bezzera and Desiderio Pavoni in the early 1900s, and then perfected by Achille Gaggia in 1948, when he developed the spring piston lever mechanism that created the 9 bars of pressure used in modern espresso and produced the crema that characterizes a well-pulled shot. The Italian espresso bar, standing at a zinc counter, drinking a tiny cup of intense, dark coffee in approximately 90 seconds, paying a regulated price that has historically been fixed by the Italian government, is one of the most efficient and pleasurable coffee rituals in the world. The cappuccino, the macchiato, the Americano, the flat white in its Australian variation. All of these are children of the Italian espresso tradition, spread globally by Italian emigration and the worldwide adoption of espresso machines by commercial coffee chains. The United States presents a study in contradictions. By total volume, America is the world's largest single-country coffee market. Approximately 750,000 metric tons consumed annually, but by per capita consumption, it sits around 24th globally, with roughly 4.2 kilograms per person per year. Americans drink a lot of coffee, but they drink it in large formats. The American drip coffee tradition produces cups of 12, 16, 20 ounces, rather than the European demitasse or the Finnish mug, and the per capita statistics therefore understate the cultural centrality of coffee to American daily life. Coffee consumption in America runs at approximately 3 cups per day for regular drinkers, and the ritual of the morning coffee, whether made at home in a drip machine, collected from a drive-through, or carried in a paper cup from the office building lobby, is as embedded in American cultural rhythm as any equivalent ritual elsewhere. The history of coffee in America begins with the coffeehouses of colonial New England and the specific political significance that coffee acquired after the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when drinking coffee rather than British tax tea became an act of political identity for American patriots. Switching from tea to coffee was not merely a consumer choice, but a statement of allegiance, and the association between American identity and coffee that formed in that revolutionary moment has persisted through the centuries in ways that still subtly shape American coffee culture. The fact that America is a coffee nation, while Britain, which had the same colonial coffeehouse tradition, remained predominantly a tea nation, can be partially attributed to a tax protest over 250 years ago. The second wave of American coffee culture, which arrived with the rise of Starbucks in the late 1980s and 1990s, transformed coffee from a commodity product, bought in tins from the grocery store, brewed in a drip machine, consumed for function rather than pleasure, into an experience product, a lifestyle signal, and a social space. Howard Schultz's vision for Starbucks was explicitly modeled on the Italian espresso bar tradition he encountered during a visit to Milan in 1983, though the American adaptation transformed the quick-standing Italian espresso ritual into a sit-down, laptop-open, 3-hour occupy-a-table experience that the Italians find bewildering. The Starbucks model spread globally with a speed that demonstrated the latent demand for a comfortable public space oriented around coffee, and by 2026 the company operates over 36,000 stores in more than 80 countries, making it the largest coffee chain in the world by a considerable margin. The third wave of coffee culture, which emerged in the early 2000s and continues to develop, represents a deliberate reaction against the corporate standardization of the second wave. Third wave coffee treats the bean as an artisanal agricultural product with specific origins, specific processing methods, specific flavor profiles that deserve to be understood and appreciated rather than masked in dark roast and flavored syrup. Specialty coffee roasters, small, often independently owned operations with direct trade relationships with farmers, careful roast profiles, and coffee served by baristas trained to discuss origin and extraction with the fluency of sommeliers discussing wine, have proliferated in cities across the world and have elevated the standard of what a good cup of coffee can be. The specialty coffee movement has also raised serious questions about price, sustainability, and the economics of a global supply chain, in which the farmer who grows the coffee often receives a fraction of a percent of the retail price the consumer pays, while the intermediate steps of processing, trading, roasting, and serving capture the majority of the value. Historians still argue whether the third wave is genuinely transformative for the economics of coffee farming. The direct trade relationships that specialty roasters emphasize do, in principle, return more value to the producer, or whether it represents a form of premium marketing that benefits mainly the wealthy consumers who can afford to pay $10 for a pour-over. The answer is probably that it is both simultaneously, which is the kind of honest complexity that the coffee world, at its best, is increasingly willing to acknowledge. The cup is complex. The industry is complex. The history is long, and we are not done with it yet. Brazil is the size of a continent. It occupies nearly half of South America, contains the world's largest tropical rainforest, and has a topographic and climatic diversity so enormous that it can simultaneously host Arctic-level cold snaps in its southern states and equatorial heat in its northern ones. And across a substantial portion of its southeastern interior, the states of Minas Gerais, São Paulo, Espírito Santo, and Bahia, it grows approximately 1/3 of all the coffee produced on Earth. This is not a recent achievement. Brazil has been the world's largest coffee producer for the last 150 years, a dominance so consistent and so complete that it has essentially defined what the global commodity coffee market looks like, how coffee is priced, and what most people in most countries have been drinking for most of the modern era. The Brazilian coffee landscape is not what most people imagine when they think of a coffee farm. The romantic image: small family plots on steep hillsides, pickers moving carefully through rows of shade trees, altitude mist and bird song and the smell of ripe cherries in the cool morning air, describes parts of the Brazilian specialty sector, but not the mainstream of the industry. The majority of Brazilian coffee is grown on large, flat, or gently rolling farms in the Cerrado, the savanna region of central Minas Gerais and neighboring states, where the terrain is accessible enough for the mechanical harvesters that allow a single operator to process acres of coffee in hours. These machines straddle the tree rows and use vibrating fingers or brush systems to strip or shake cherries from the branches, collecting everything in a single pass, regardless of ripeness. A method called strip picking that sacrifices the precision of selective hand picking for the efficiency of scale. The result of this mechanized, high-volume approach is that Brazilian coffee, in its commodity form, is not the most complex or distinctive coffee in the world. It is consistent, mild, low acid, with notes of chocolate and nuts that blend easily with other origins and provide the smooth, inoffensive base that makes it ideal for espresso blends and commercial roasting. About 90% of the world's espresso blends contain Brazilian coffee, often at 50 to 60% of the blend's composition, precisely because Brazilian beans provide body and sweetness without imposing strong flavor opinions of their own. The specialty sector within Brazil has grown significantly in recent years, with producers in higher altitude regions developing washed and natural processed single origin coffees of genuine complexity. But the country's global role remains primarily that of the world's largest supplier of reliable, affordable, excellent blending coffee. The political history of Brazil is threaded through with coffee in ways that are impossible to separate. The period from the 1880s to the 1930s is sometimes called the café com leite era, coffee with milk, a reference to the fact that the dominant political power resided with the agrarian oligarchs of São Paulo, the coffee state, and Minas Gerais, the dairy state, and the interests of the coffee plantation owners shaped Brazilian federal policy so thoroughly that the government actively intervened in the global coffee market to prop up prices during periods of oversupply. The 1906 Taubaté Agreement established a system of government coffee valorization, buying excess harvests and storing them to control the available supply and prevent price crashes. That was an early and remarkable example of a primary commodity producer attempting to manage its own market. It worked for a while, then contributed to the overproduction that collapsed prices in the early 1930s, a crisis that helped destabilize the Brazilian political order and contributed to the revolution that brought Getúlio Vargas to power. Coffee's influence on Brazilian politics was, at its peak, total and unapologetic. Ethiopia, where the story of coffee began, occupies a position in the global industry that is simultaneously foundational and economically precarious. The country is the world's fifth largest coffee producer and Africa's largest, producing approximately 400,000 to 500,000 metric tons per year across an extraordinary diversity of growing regions: Yirgacheffe, Sidama, Limu, Jimma, Harar, Kaffa, Bench, each with its own microclimate, altitude, soil type, and flavor profile. Ethiopian coffee is the genetic wellspring from which the entire global industry flows. The wild Arabica varieties of the Ethiopian highlands contain more genetic diversity than all the cultivated varieties grown in the rest of the world combined, representing an irreplaceable library of botanical variation that plant breeders look to for resistance to disease, drought, and the changing conditions that climate change is imposing on coffee growing worldwide. More than 15 million Ethiopians, approximately 15% of the country's population, are directly or indirectly involved in coffee production, making it the single most important economic activity in the country. Coffee accounts for roughly 30% of Ethiopia's foreign export earnings, which makes the entire national economy vulnerable to the price fluctuations of the global commodity market in a way that creates real hardship when prices fall. A collapse in global coffee prices, as happened in 2001 when prices fell to below $35 per 60 kilogram bag, the lowest inflation-adjusted level in a century, translates directly into reduced income for millions of farming families, some of the most economically marginal people in a relatively poor country, at the far end of a supply chain whose considerable total value they capture very little of. The Ethiopian coffee ceremony is the most vivid expression of coffee culture as social ritual that exists anywhere in the world, and it is worth describing in some detail because it represents a relationship with the beverage that is entirely different from the quick, instrumental consumption that most Western coffee culture is built around. The ceremony is performed by women, typically in the morning or afternoon, and takes place on a specially prepared space. A mat covered with fresh grass, with the grass's fragrance serving as part of the sensory atmosphere. Green coffee beans are washed and then roasted in a flat pan over hot coals, stirred constantly with a long-handled wooden spoon, and the roasting pan is brought around for guests to smell and appreciate as the beans darken and release their aroma. The roasted beans are ground in a wooden mortar and pestle, a task requiring some strength and considerable rhythm. And the grounds are transferred to a black clay coffee pot called a jibina, with a spherical base, a narrow neck, and a curved spout. Water is boiled in the jibina over the coals, the grounds added and the pot returned to the heat for a period of simmering. The coffee is poured from a height into small, handleless ceramic cups called Sinai, the thin stream of dark liquid aerating as it falls, and served with sugar and sometimes with traditional snacks, popcorn, bread, or roasted barley. A full ceremony involves 3 rounds of coffee, the first called a bowl, the second tona, the third baraka, meaning blessing, and each round is made from the same grounds, progressively weaker, but each with its own significance. To leave before the third cup is considered rude. The ceremony typically takes 1 to 2 hours from start to finish, and its purpose is not merely the consumption of coffee, but the creation of communal space. Time set aside for conversation, for presence, for the specific quality of attention that being with other people around a shared ritual produces. This is coffee in its oldest social form, still practiced in millions of Ethiopian households and community spaces, essentially unchanged from the tradition that the Sufi scholars of Yemen would have recognized when they received Ethiopian coffee for the first time in the 15th century. The jabina, the Sinai, the fresh grass on the floor, the roasting over coals. These are not cultural performances for tourists. They are living tradition carried forward by millions of people for whom coffee is inseparable from the fabric of daily social life in the most literal and immediate way. Kenya produces significantly less coffee than Ethiopia by volume, approximately 50,000 metric tons per year compared to Ethiopia's 500,000, but punches far above its weight in terms of quality and price on the specialty market. Kenyan coffee, grown at high altitudes on the slopes of Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Range in volcanic red soil that is unique in its chemical composition, is famous for its intense, bright acidity and the complex berry and citrus flavors, blackcurrant, tomato, grapefruit, that make well-made Kenya AA, the kind of coffee that stops experienced drinkers mid-cup to pay attention. The Kenyan auction system, in which coffee is sold weekly at the Nairobi Coffee Exchange in a competitive bidding process, creates price transparency that other producing countries have attempted to replicate, and Kenyan coffee regularly commands among the highest prices per kilogram in the specialty market. The relationship between producing countries and the global coffee market has been a contested one throughout the modern era. Coffee is classified as a soft commodity and traded on futures exchanges in New York and London, where prices are set not by the conversations between farmers and roasters, but by the speculative calculations of traders who may never have touched a coffee cherry in their lives. The volatility of these market prices, which can move dramatically in response to Brazilian weather forecasts, currency fluctuations, or shifts in investment sentiment entirely unrelated to the physical supply and demand for coffee, creates a structural vulnerability for producing country farmers who have no ability to influence the price their product receives at the point of sale. Fair trade certification, direct trade relationships, and various premium pricing schemes have been developed to address this structural imbalance, with mixed success and considerable ongoing debate about which approaches actually improve farmer livelihoods rather than simply creating a premium marketing tier for wealthy consumers. The coffee in your cup has traveled further economically and geographically than almost any other agricultural product you consume. Its story connects Ethiopian highlands to Finnish kitchens, Vietnamese hillsides to Italian espresso bars, Colombian family farms to London specialty cafes, in a chain of exchange and transformation so long and so complex that every sip is, in some sense, a summary of the modern world. On a hillside in Sumatra, in the Indonesian province of Aceh, there is a coffee that begins its production process inside the digestive system of a small cat-like mammal called the Asian palm civet. The civet, a nocturnal, solitary creature with a pointed face and a striped or spotted coat, built something like a cross between a cat and a weasel, feeds opportunistically on ripe coffee cherries in the wild, selecting the ripest and most aromatic fruit with a discernment that farmers grudgingly acknowledge. The cherry passes through the civet's digestive system, where enzymes in the stomach partially break down the proteins in the coffee seed, altering the bean's chemical structure in ways that affect the flavor of the coffee, eventually brewed from it. The seeds, still intact within their parchment, pass through the animal and are collected from the forest floor, cleaned, dried, and processed into what is marketed as the world's most expensive coffee. This is Kopi Luwak civet coffee, and it retails in its authenticated wild-sourced form for anywhere between 100 and 600 US dollars per pound, making it by weight one of the most expensive food products on earth. The flavor, according to those who have paid to find out, is smoother and less bitter than standard coffee, with a particular earthiness and a reduced harshness that the enzymatic treatment of the digestive process is claimed to produce. Historians still argue whether Kopi Luwak is genuinely superior coffee or an extraordinary example of marketing attached to a curious production method, and blind tasting studies have produced results suggesting that experienced coffee professionals, when they do not know what they are drinking, do not consistently identify it as exceptional. What is beyond dispute is that the story sells, and that the market for the concept of civet-digested coffee has proved remarkably robust to skepticism. The Kopi Luwak tradition developed in the Dutch colonial era in Indonesia, when plantation workers were forbidden from picking coffee cherries for their own use, but discovered that the beans excreted by civets, which they collected from the forest floor, were not subject to the same prohibition. It is an origin story that contains, in miniature, the entire dynamic of colonial coffee production. The labor of the exploited worker, finding a creative path through the restrictions imposed by the colonial authority, with the byproduct of that creativity, eventually becoming a luxury product that costs more than the workers who discovered it could afford in a year of labor. The ethical complications of the modern Kopi Luwak industry are significant. The demand created by the premium market has led to widespread civet farming under conditions that animal welfare organizations describe as deeply problematic, with wild civets kept in small cages and force-fed coffee cherries rather than ranging freely and selecting their own fruit. Indonesia more broadly is the world's fourth largest coffee producer, and its contribution to global coffee culture goes well beyond Kopi Luwak. The Indonesian archipelago, Java, Sumatra, Sulawesi, Flores, Bali, and dozens of smaller islands produces a range of coffees as diverse as its geography, with each island's distinct volcanic soil, altitude, and processing traditions creating characteristic flavor profiles. Sumatran coffee in particular occupies a unique position in the specialty market for its heavy body, low acidity, and specific earthy, herbal, almost savory character, described variously as notes of cedar, tobacco, dark chocolate, and forest floor, that results partly from the island's terroir and partly from the wet hulling process called giling basa, which involves hulling the coffee at a higher moisture content than any other processing method, producing beans with a distinctive irregular shape and a flavor profile that is unlike anything grown anywhere else. The coffee universe is full of these productive accidents, regional peculiarities, and local innovations that have become defining characteristics of specific origins. Jamaica's Blue Mountain coffee, grown in the mountains above Kingston at elevations up to 7,000 feet and certified under strict regulations, produces a cup of extraordinary mildness and balance, low bitterness, delicate sweetness, very little acidity, that has made it one of the most sought-after and expensive certified coffees in the world, with Japan consuming the majority of the production at prices that reflect a combination of genuine quality and considerable marketing mystique. Hawaii's Kona district on the slopes of Mauna Loa on the Big Island produces coffee in the only American-grown commercial tradition with a mild, bright, complex character that the volcanic soil and the specific pattern of morning sun and afternoon cloud cover in the Kona belt produces with reliable elegance. Yemen, where the entire tradition of coffee brewing began, still produces coffee in the mountain terraces of its highlands, still using essentially the same dry, natural processing method that was used 500 years ago. The whole cherries spread on rooftops to dry in the sun, then hand-milled to remove the husks. Yemeni coffee has a flavor profile unlike anything else in the world. Deeply fruity, wine-like, complex in a way that suggests a living thing rather than a commodity, with notes of dried fruit, tamarind, and a subtle, fermented quality that comes from the traditional processing. The ongoing civil war that has devastated Yemen since 2015 has severely disrupted coffee production and export, cutting off international buyers from one of the most historically significant origins in the world. At a moment when specialty coffee's interest in unique and authentic origins had created genuine demand for Yemeni beans, the farmers who continue growing coffee in the highlands do so in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, and the coffee they produce, when it does reach international buyers, commands premium prices that reflect both its quality and its scarcity. The specialty coffee world's fascination with origin and provenance has driven a remarkable expansion in the number and variety of coffees available to consumers who are prepared to pay attention and spend accordingly. Single origin coffees from specific regions, estates, and even individual lots within an estate, identified by the farmer's name, the processing method, the specific variety of coffee plant, and the altitude and harvest date, are now routinely offered by specialty roasters who compete to source the most distinctive and traceable beans from the most compelling stories. The Cup of Excellence program, which holds national competitions in coffee-producing countries and auctions the winning lots internationally, has become one of the most important mechanisms for both identifying exceptional coffees and directing premium prices back to the farmers who grew them, with top lots regularly selling at auction for $20, $50, or even over $100 per pound green, multiples of the commodity market price that represent genuinely life-changing income for the farmers involved. The variety of the coffee plant itself has become a subject of intense interest in the specialty world. Within Coffea arabica, there are hundreds of distinct cultivated varieties, or cultivars, some ancient and traditional, some developed through breeding programs, some discovered growing wild in Ethiopian or Yemeni forests. The Bourbon variety, brought from Yemen to the French island of Bourbon, now Réunion, in the early 18th century, spread through Central and South America and became one of the most important cultivars in specialty coffee, prized for its complex sweetness and fruit character. The Typica variety, probably the first Arabica cultivar brought to the Americas, forms the genetic basis of Jamaican Blue Mountain and Kona coffee. Gesha, or geisha, a variety originally from the Geisha region of Ethiopia, was brought to Costa Rica via Panama and planted at the Hacienda La Esmeralda estate in the Boquete region of Panama, where in 2004 it produced a coffee of such stunning quality with such intense and distinctive floral and jasmine notes that it sold at auction for a then record price and launched an ongoing global obsession with the variety that shows no signs of abating. The geisha story is, in miniature, the story of how the specialty coffee world functions at its best. An ancient Ethiopian variety, forgotten for decades, in a research collection, planted almost by accident in a new terroir, producing something so spectacular that it changes the price expectations and quality standards of an entire industry. It is also, less flatteringly, an example of how quickly something rare and extraordinary can be commodified. Within a decade of Hacienda La Esmeralda's first auction record, geisha was being planted across Central America, Asia, and Africa, and coffee marketed as geisha appeared at price points ranging from the genuinely exceptional to the merely expensive, without much evident correlation between the two. The variety travels. The terroir does not. What all of these coffees share, from the Kopi Luwak of Sumatra to the geisha of Panama to the ancient natural processed beans of the Yemeni highlands, is their connection to a single origin. Those wild trees in the highlands of southwestern Ethiopia, growing in the forest shade, fruiting their small red cherries in seasonal rhythm, unaware of the extraordinary global industry that sprouted from their seeds. Every cup of coffee anywhere in the world is genetically an Ethiopian thing. Every roaster who carefully develops a profile for a Kenyan AB, and every farmer in Colombia who selects only the ripest cherries, and every Finnish worker exercising their legal right to a kavitauko, and every Viennese cafe habitué who has been sitting at the same marble table with the same newspaper for 30 years. All of them are downstream of those highland forest trees, and of whatever it was that first drew a human being to taste the red fruit hanging from their branches. The debt to Ethiopia is enormous. Whether the global coffee industry has acknowledged and compensated it proportionally is a question with an uncomfortable answer that the industry has been gradually reckoning with, imperfectly and incompletely, for the past 2 decades. There is a moment in the life of every serious coffee drinker when they encounter a cup that stops them completely. Not a cup that is merely good or satisfying or welcome. Those are common enough. But a cup that produces a specific quality of surprise, a moment of arrested attention in which you lower the vessel and look at it, actually look at it, as if the object might explain what just happened in your mouth. The flavors were too specific, too vivid, too clearly something rather than the generalized darkness and bitterness that you have been navigating since you first drank coffee as a teenager and decided that if this was what adults chose voluntarily, then adulthood was a complicated proposition. That moment of a coffee being genuinely, specifically, surprisingly good is what the specialty coffee movement has been trying to reliably produce and deliver for the past 2 decades. And the systems and skills and supply chains it has built in pursuit of that goal represent one of the more interesting developments in the global food industry of the early 21st century. To understand how that system works and what happens between the farm we have been discussing and the cup that stops you, it helps to spend time with the people who sit at its center, the roasters, the buyers, the baristas, and the assessors who speak the specialized language of sensory evaluation that the specialty world has developed for the purposes of describing and comparing coffee with sufficient precision to be commercially useful. Green coffee buying is the foundation of the specialty roaster's operation, and it begins with cupping. The standardized tasting protocol, developed by the Specialty Coffee Association, to allow consistent sensory evaluation of coffees from different origins, lots, and processing methods. A cupping table is a long counter with rows of identical small glasses or ceramic bowls, each containing a precise weight of coarsely ground coffee, typically around 10 to 11 grams per 200 milliliters of water. Hot water, just off the boil, is poured directly onto the grounds, and the assessors allow the coffee to steep for approximately 4 minutes. During this time, a crust of grounds forms on the surface and the volatile aromas are trapped underneath it. The assessors then lean over each cup, insert a wide spoon, and break the crust in a single smooth motion, pressing it back into the liquid and releasing the trapped aromas in a burst that rises directly to the face. The breaking of the crust is one of the most evocative sensory experiences in the coffee world. A concentrated bloom of aroma that can tell an experienced cupper enormous amounts about the coffee's quality, origin, and processing before they have tasted a single sip. After the grounds settle and the liquid cools to a drinkable temperature, around 160 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, the assessors cup the coffee, drawing the liquid into the mouth with an aggressive slurping action specifically designed to aerate the coffee and spread it across the entire surface of the tongue simultaneously, maximizing contact with the taste receptors. The slurping is not poor manners, it is technique, and people who do it professionally are extremely good at it, which is one of those professional skills that is simultaneously impressive and unlikely to feature prominently on a first date. The language used to describe what is perceived during cupping has been formalized into the coffee taster's flavor wheel, originally developed in the 1990s and significantly updated in 2016 through a collaboration between the Specialty Coffee Association and World Coffee Research. The wheel organizes the flavor descriptors of coffee into a radial structure from broad categories at the center: floral, fruity, sour, green, other, roasted, spices, nutty, sweet, chocolatey, to increasingly specific subcategories moving outward. At the outer edge of the wheel are the most precise descriptors: bergamot, jasmine, rose, blackcurrant, cherry, grapefruit, brown butter, hazelnut, vanilla, dark chocolate, Using the wheel, an assessor can locate their perception with enough specificity that another assessor, reading the description, can form a relatively accurate mental model of what the coffee tastes like. A shared vocabulary for experiences that would otherwise be locked inside individual subjectivity. The Specialty Coffee Association's cupping protocol also produces numerical scores, with coffees scoring 80 or above on a 100-point scale classified as specialty grade. These scores encompass 10 categories: fragrance and aroma, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, body, balance, uniformity, clean cup, sweetness, and an overall impression score, each assessed on a 10-point scale. A score of 80 is the threshold between commodity coffee and specialty coffee, and the difference between a 79 and an 81 is commercially significant. The former will be sold into the bulk market, the latter can be marketed as specialty, and command a premium price. Scores above 90 are considered exceptional by any standard, and coffees scoring in the low 90s at Cup of Excellence competitions routinely sell for $40 to $80 per pound at auction. The barista who stands between the roasted bean and the finished cup has become, in the specialty world, a professional with a level of training and expertise that would have seemed eccentric to anyone in the coffee industry 30 years ago. The World Barista Championship, held annually since 2000, requires competitors to prepare 4 espressos, 4 milk-based beverages, and 4 signature beverages in a 15-minute performance set, evaluated by certified judges on technical precision, sensory quality, and presentation. The competition has driven the development of barista technique to a level of refinement: temperature profiling, pressure profiling, precise dose and extraction measurement, meticulous attention to grind particle distribution, that treats espresso preparation as a serious craft discipline rather than a service job. Milk steaming, which sounds straightforward until you try to do it well, is its own science and art. The transformation of cold milk into the silky, glossy, micro-foamed texture that a well-made flat white or cappuccino requires involves heating the milk to between 140 and 155 degrees Fahrenheit, while simultaneously incorporating air in precise quantities and distributing it throughout the liquid in bubbles so small they are not individually visible. The surface should look like wet paint, smooth and reflective, with none of the large bubbles that characterize poorly steamed milk. This texture is achieved by positioning the steam wand at a precise angle and depth in the milk jug and using a specific rotational motion to create a vortex that folds air into the liquid rather than just blasting it in. Done correctly, the steamed milk can be poured into a shot of espresso in patterns, a heart, a rosetta, a tulip, through a technique called latte art that combines the visual and sensory experience of the drink in a way that has become both a professional skill and a form of social media currency. The espresso machine that makes all of this possible is a remarkable piece of engineering. A commercial espresso machine maintains water at a precise temperature, typically around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and delivers it through the coffee puck at 9 bars of pressure, approximately 9 times atmospheric pressure, for an extraction time of typically 25 to 30 seconds. The pressure is what makes espresso rather than very strong drip coffee. It forces water through the coffee faster than gravity alone would allow, producing the characteristic concentrated syrupy texture and the layer of crema that distinguishes a well-pulled shot. The crema is not just aesthetic. It is an emulsion of coffee oils, fine particles, and carbon dioxide bubbles that carries aromatic compounds in a suspension that would not form in low-pressure brewing, contributing to the intensity and persistence of espresso's flavor. The proliferation of home espresso equipment over the past 2 decades has brought this level of precision within reach of the domestic market, with semi-automatic machines from manufacturers like Breville, DeLonghi, and La Marzocco, allowing home baristas to approach the consistency of commercial preparation at a cost that, while significant, is not beyond the reach of the serious enthusiast. The home coffee equipment market has grown dramatically alongside the specialty coffee movement, with high-quality burr grinders, precise kettles with temperature control, scales sensitive to tenths of a gram, and a variety of manual brewing devices. The AeroPress, the Chemex, the V60, the Kaldi Wave, the French press, all competing for the attention of consumers who have decided that the cup they make at home is worth investing in. The AeroPress deserves a moment of particular attention because it represents something unusual in the coffee world, a piece of equipment genuinely invented by accident in the 21st century by someone with no background in coffee. Alan Adler, a Stanford engineering instructor who had previously invented the Aerobee flying ring, developed the AeroPress in 2005 as an attempt to make a single cup of good coffee quickly, using air pressure to drive the brew through the grounds. The device, a plastic cylinder with a plunger used to force hot water through coffee in 30 to 60 seconds, turned out to produce remarkably clean, smooth, and flexible coffee, and its portability, durability, and low price made it enormously popular with travelers, campers, and specialty coffee enthusiasts who wanted excellent coffee without equipment that weighed 10 kilograms. The AeroPress World Championship, first held in 2008, now attracts hundreds of competitors annually who develop elaborate, idiosyncratic recipes, inverted, bypass, concentrated, room temperature, that explore the device's flexibility in ways its inventor certainly did not anticipate. The coffee world, at its present moment, is a place of genuine excitement and genuine tension. Excited about quality, provenance, and the depth of craft available at every stage of the supply chain. Tense about sustainability, equity, climate change, and the structural economics that continue to direct the majority of coffee's considerable global value toward the consuming country end of the chain, rather than the producing country end. The barista competition champion in Seoul and the smallholder farmer in Yirgacheffe are both essential to the cup, and the gap between their economic circumstances reflects something about the global trade system that a good cup of coffee cannot fix, but can perhaps make visible to the person drinking it. Visibility is the beginning of attention. Attention is the beginning of change. And the coffee, in the meantime, is getting better. There is a specific quality of morning that belongs entirely to coffee. Not the morning itself, which belongs to everyone regardless of what they drink, but a particular version of it, a version defined by the ritual that precedes the first cup, the kettle filling, the grinder running, the smell that appears in the room before the coffee is even brewed, rising from the open bag of beans with a generosity that seems disproportionate to the small domestic act of opening a sealed package. The wait, brief but significant, while the brewing happens, and then the first sip, which lands in a way that the 10th sip of the same day will not, carrying with it the specific weight of being first warmth, first caffeine, first flavor, first moment of the day, in which the brain makes contact with the world on its own terms. This ritual dimension of coffee, the daily ceremony performed at domestic scale, repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, is one of the most underexamined aspects of the beverage's hold on its drinkers. Coffee is not just a drink that people consume, it is a practice that people perform, and the performance matters as much as the product. Research into habitual behavior suggests that the ritualistic aspects of coffee consumption, the specific sequence of actions, the sensory triggers of smell and sound and warmth, the temporal anchoring of coffee to particular moments of the day, contribute significantly to the psychological experience of the drink, producing comfort and readiness that are partly chemical and partly the result of deeply conditioned association. The smell of coffee brewing does not just smell good. For hundreds of millions of people, it means something. It means morning, or break time, or the moment of transition between work and rest, or the beginning of a conversation with someone they love. And those meanings layer over the sensory experience and make the drink larger than it chemically is. The anthropological study of coffee rituals across different cultures reveals an extraordinary diversity of practice built around a single raw material. We have already visited the Ethiopian coffee ceremony with its 3 rounds and its fresh grass and its hours of communal time. Consider now the Turkish coffee tradition, which was inscribed on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2013. Perhaps the first time a specific brewing method has received that level of international cultural recognition. Turkish coffee is made by combining very finely ground coffee, powdered to a consistency finer than espresso, almost talcum soft, with cold water and sugar in a small long-handled copper or brass pot called a shezve or ibrik, and heating the mixture gently over low heat until it froths to the brim. The frothing is carefully managed. The foam is the mark of a well-made Turkish coffee, and a cup presented without foam is considered inferior preparation. The coffee is poured, grounds and all, into small porcelain cups and allowed to settle before drinking. The grounds remain in the cup, and when the coffee is finished, turning the cup upside down on its saucer and allowing the grounds to form patterns has been practiced as a form of fortune-telling called tasseography for centuries, a tradition that gave coffee a mystical dimension beyond its chemical effects, and that persists in Turkish, Greek, and Arabic coffee culture to this day. The ritual of fortune-telling from coffee grounds produced one of coffee history's more entertaining controversies. In the Ottoman court, coffee readings were taken seriously enough that they occasionally influenced political decisions, and the interpretation of the grounds in a cup was a matter of some social delicacy. If the grounds of a sultan's coffee formed a pattern that a court reader interpreted as inauspicious, reporting that interpretation honestly was not without risk, the resulting incentive toward favorable readings may have contributed to the generally positive reputation that coffee ground divination acquired over time, which is the kind of structural bias that social scientists call confirmation bias, and the Ottoman court probably called being sensible. Vietnamese coffee culture, built on the Robusta tradition that French colonialism established and the country's own culinary ingenuity developed has produced one of the most distinctive and internationally beloved coffee drinks in the world, sapé suaja, iced coffee with sweetened condensed milk. The preparation involves a small metal drip filter called a fin, a device of elegant simplicity, essentially a perforated metal chamber that sits on top of a glass and allows hot water to drip slowly through a bed of finely ground Robusta coffee under the gentle pressure of a loose metal press, producing a small quantity of very strong, dark, intensely flavored coffee that drips through over the course of 3 to 5 minutes. This concentrated coffee is then poured over ice in a glass already containing a generous quantity of sweetened condensed milk. The milk chosen specifically because fresh milk was historically less available in Vietnam than in European coffee cultures, and because condensed milk's sweetness balances the bitter intensity of Robusta in a way that counterpoints rather than masks. The result is cold, sweet, intensely strong, deeply satisfying, and somewhat alarming to anyone who was expecting something milder. It is coffee maximalism in a glass, and it has acquired devoted followers in every country it has reached. The Japanese approach to coffee represents a different kind of intensity. The intensity of precision rather than strength. Japan has developed one of the most sophisticated coffee cultures in the world, particularly in its major cities, built around a combination of the kisaten, the traditional Japanese coffee house, which emerged in the early 20th century and typically serves hand-drip coffee prepared with unhurried attention using pour-over methods, and a modern specialty scene of remarkable seriousness. Japanese baristas have been among the most technically accomplished in the world for decades, and the Japanese market's expectations of consistency and quality have driven equipment and technique development that has benefited the global coffee industry. Japan is also the birthplace of canned coffee, the convenience store and vending machine coffee in small pull-tab cans that represents the opposite end of the coffee experience spectrum from the kisaten's careful pour-over. And that speaks to the Japanese ability to hold two very different versions of the same thing simultaneously without apparent contradiction. The relationship between coffee and literature is long, intimate, and somewhat caffeinated. Voltaire reportedly drank 40 to 50 cups of coffee per day, a consumption level that raises genuine medical questions but perhaps explains the productivity, and is said to have continued the habit into old age despite being warned by his physician that coffee was a slow poison, responding that he had been drinking it for 80 years and seemed in no immediate danger. Honoré de Balzac, the French novelist, who produced an almost incomprehensible volume of work during his relatively short life, was a legendary coffee consumer who wrote enthusiastically about the effects of very strong coffee on the creative mind, describing how it mobilizes the brain's resources, sharpens perception, and produces a kind of electric clarity that he found essential to sustained literary work. Whether his coffee consumption contributed to the cardiac problems that killed him at 51 is a question that doctors of the era and since have found interesting. His output in the meantime was extraordinary, so the cost-benefit analysis remains genuinely ambiguous. Beethoven reportedly counted exactly 60 coffee beans for each cup he made, which is either a charming example of the composer's famous attention to detail or evidence that he had too much time on his hands before the morning coffee kicked in. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote a comic cantata in 1735, the Coffee Cantata, in which a young woman argues with her father about her right to drink coffee, which he considers an inappropriate indulgence. The daughter's position in the debate is that she would sooner give up 3 suitors than give up her daily coffee, which is both a strong statement of preference and an interesting window into how embedded coffee had become in German urban life less than a century after its European arrival. Historians still argue whether the Coffee Cantata was a straightforward comedy, a subtle commentary on changing social customs, or a piece of commercial content effectively funded by the coffeehouse culture of Bach's Leipzig, where it was likely performed. But the 3 interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The connection between coffee and creative work is not merely anecdotal or historical. The mild but genuine enhancement of focus, working memory, and sustained attention that moderate caffeine consumption produces has been documented in cognitive science research, and the specific combination of a caffeinated stimulant with the social and sensory environment of a coffee house. Background noise at a level that research has found conducive to creative thinking, the presence of other people as a mild social stimulant, the warmth and comfort of the physical environment, may genuinely support the kind of diffuse, associative mental work that creative tasks require. The philosophers claim that their best ideas happen in coffee houses may be partly right and not entirely for reasons they understand. The coffee house, as a physical space, has evolved considerably from the penny universities of 17th century London and the literary salons of 18th century Paris to the laptop-filled third spaces of the contemporary city. But its fundamental social function has remained surprisingly constant. It is a place that is not home and not work, where the price of a drink purchases the right to be present for as long as you need to be in the company of strangers who are simultaneously part of the ambient social experience and entirely irrelevant to your particular purpose. The contemporary coffee shop, with its carefully curated playlist and its single origin filter coffee and its population of people who are all pretending to work or actually working or somewhere in the philosophical middle ground, is a direct descendant of Jonathan's Coffee House and Lloyd's Coffee House and the Café de Procope. Spaces where the beverage is the excuse and the real product is time, presence, and the particular quality of being somewhere without obligation that the modern world provides less and less of. The cup of coffee enables all of this, as it has always enabled all of this, from the Sufi monasteries of Yemen to the Vienna Café to the small white paper cup balanced on the edge of a laptop in a glass-fronted coffee shop on a busy street in a city that is too loud and too fast and is improved, materially and significantly, by the warmth in the hand. The coffee plant is in trouble. Not immediately, not catastrophically, not in the way that produces headlines and emergency responses, but in the slow, accumulating, difficult to reverse way that ecological shifts tend to manifest. The kind of trouble that reveals itself in changed flowering times and irregular rains and temperatures that no longer match the conditions the plant evolved to inhabit, and that builds year on year into something the industry will eventually have to reckon with, whether or not it is currently choosing to pay attention. Climate change is the most significant long-term threat facing coffee production, and the research on its projected impacts is consistent enough and serious enough that it deserves more than a passing mention in a story about coffee. The Coffea arabica plant, which provides the vast majority of the world's finest coffee and the entirety of the specialty sector's raw material, is among the more climate-sensitive major agricultural crops. It requires a specific and narrow range of temperature, rainfall, and seasonal pattern to produce fruit of good quality, and it does not adapt easily to conditions outside that range. When temperatures rise above approximately 73 degrees Fahrenheit during the growing season, the plant's metabolic processes are disrupted, cherry development is accelerated in ways that reduce sugar accumulation, and cup quality declines. When rainfall becomes irregular, arriving in the wrong season or failing to arrive at all, the plant's flowering and fruiting cycle is disrupted in ways that reduce yield and increase vulnerability to disease. A study published in the journal PLOS One in 2014 projected that by 2080, climate change could reduce the area suitable for wild coffee growing in Ethiopia, the genetic homeland of Arabica and the repository of the wild genetic diversity that the global industry depends on, by 65 to 99% under various warming scenarios. More recent research has produced similarly alarming projections for cultivated coffee across all major producing regions, though the timelines and magnitudes vary by location and emission scenario. The highlands of Colombia, which currently benefit from a relatively stable climate, are expected to remain viable for longer than lower altitude regions. The lowland areas of Vietnam and Brazil, which produce primarily Robusta or lower-grade Arabica, face more immediate pressure. The Kenyan highlands, whose specific combination of altitude and volcanic soil produces some of the world's finest coffee, are experiencing changing rainfall patterns that farmers are documenting in real time. Coffee leaf rust, a fungal disease caused by the pathogen Himalaya vastatrix, the same organism that destroyed Sri Lanka's coffee industry in the 19th century and prompted the switch to tea, is the most serious immediate biological threat to coffee production, and climate change is making it worse. The fungus thrives in warm, humid conditions, spreading through airborne spores that land on coffee leaves, germinate, and produce the characteristic orange-yellow rust pustules that give the disease its name. Infected leaves drop from the plant, reducing its photosynthetic capacity and, in severe cases, killing the tree entirely. Coffee leaf rust spread through the Americas in the 1970s and has become endemic in every major producing country. A particularly severe outbreak in Central America from 2012 to 2014 destroyed approximately 60% of the coffee crop across the region, costing an estimated $500 million in losses and leaving hundreds of thousands of farm workers unemployed. Warming temperatures that allow the fungus to survive and spread at higher altitudes, previously too cold for the pathogen, are pushing coffee leaf rust into growing regions that were formerly protected by elevation. The response to these threats is being developed on multiple fronts simultaneously with varying degrees of urgency and resource allocation. Plant breeding programs, led by World Coffee Research and national agricultural institutions in Ethiopia, Colombia, Kenya, and other major producing countries, are working to develop new Arabica varieties that combine the cup quality of the best existing varieties with greater disease resistance, drought tolerance, and heat tolerance. This work involves both conventional selective breeding, crossing varieties with desirable traits and selecting for the best combinations over multiple generations, and the genetic analysis of wild Ethiopian coffee varieties, which contain resistance genes for diseases and stresses that cultivated varieties have lost through the narrowing of the gene pool that occurred when coffee was taken out of Ethiopia and propagated around the world from a small number of founding plants. The wild coffee forests of Ethiopia are therefore not merely the origin of the world's coffee industry, they are its emergency genetic reserve, the repository of traits that may prove essential for the industry's survival under climate change. The conservation of these forests is consequently not just an environmental issue, but a commercially urgent agricultural priority, and organizations working on coffee sustainability have increasingly emphasized the connection between forest conservation in Ethiopia and the long-term viability of global coffee production as a way of making the case to an industry that has historically been better at consuming environmental capital than investing in it. Shade-grown coffee represents one practical approach to improving the climate resilience and environmental sustainability of coffee production. Traditional coffee cultivation in most of its historic homelands was done under a canopy of native shade trees, which moderated temperature, retained soil moisture, hosted the birds and insects that control coffee pests, produced leaf litter that built soil organic matter, and created a farming system that maintained biodiversity while producing coffee. The shift toward full-sun, high-yield monoculture cultivation, driven by the development of sun-tolerant varieties and the short-term productivity gains of intensive production, removed the shade canopy from large areas of coffee growing, increasing yields for a generation while depleting soil health, reducing biodiversity, increasing the farm's vulnerability to temperature extremes, and eliminating the habitat that migratory songbirds had historically used as their primary Central American wintering grounds. Shade-grown and bird-friendly certification programs, developed from the 1990s onward, have created market incentives for farmers to restore shade canopies, with benefits that extend well beyond the coffee itself. Organic coffee cultivation, farming without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, has grown significantly as a share of global production, driven by consumer demand in wealthy markets and by the genuine economic and health benefits that organic approaches offer to smallholder farmers who might otherwise bear the costs of expensive chemical inputs. Organic certification is not without complications. It requires documentation, inspection, and transition periods that create costs and administrative burdens for small producers, and the price premium that certified organic coffee commands does not always reach the farmer in the proportion that the consumer paying the premium might expect. But the underlying principle of building soil health, maintaining biodiversity, and reducing the chemical load on farming families and their surrounding ecosystems is sound, and the organic sector of the coffee industry has been growing faster than the overall market for the past decade. Fair trade certification, which guarantees a minimum price floor and a social premium payment to certified coffee cooperatives, was designed to address the structural vulnerability of smallholder farmers to commodity price crashes of the kind that devastated coffee incomes in the early 2000s. The fair trade movement in coffee has genuine achievements to its credit. The price floor has provided real protection during market downturns. The social premium has funded community infrastructure in producing regions, and the certification requirements have driven improvements in labor and environmental standards. Its critics argue that the minimum price is often too low to constitute genuine fairness at current production costs, that the benefits flow primarily to farmers who are already relatively well organized and commercially connected rather than the most marginalized producers, and that the certification fee structure creates a barrier for the smallest and most vulnerable operations. Historians still argue whether fair trade has transformed the fundamental economics of the coffee supply chain or simply created a better marketed tier of the same system. The direct trade model, in which specialty roasters buy coffee directly from producers, often at prices well above fair trade minimums, based on quality assessment and ongoing relationships, has been celebrated as a more genuinely equitable approach than commodity certification. The best direct trade relationships involve roasters who visit farms, understand production costs, pay prices that allow farmers to invest in quality improvements, and provide feedback that helps producers develop the kind of cup quality that commands premium prices. These relationships exist, and they are genuinely valuable, and the farmers involved in the best of them are materially better off than they would be selling through conventional commodity channels. They involve, however, a relatively small number of producers and a relatively small volume of coffee, and the structural economics of the global coffee trade, in which the commodity market sets prices for the vast majority of production, are not transformed by the practices of even the most ethically serious specialty roasters. The sustainability of coffee as a global industry over the next 50 years will depend on the resolution of these tensions between quality and volume, between producer welfare and consumer price expectations, between the ecological demands of the plant and the climate pressures building around it, between the traditional knowledge of farming communities and the scientific inputs that changing conditions require. None of these tensions resolves easily or automatically. All of them are currently the subject of active work by people in the industry, the scientific community, and the policy world who understand that the coffee we are drinking today is not guaranteed to be available in the same form, from the same places, at the same prices, indefinitely. The plant that a legendary goat herder noticed in an Ethiopian highland forest roughly 12 centuries ago has given the world an extraordinary gift. 2 billion cups of daily pleasure, a global industry, a social institution, a chemical ally in the long human struggle against the pull of sleep. What the world chooses to give back to the plant and the people who grow it is a question that every cup quietly asks. The room is quieter now. If you have been listening since the beginning, you have traveled a considerable distance from Ethiopian highlands to Yemeni monasteries to Ottoman coffeehouses to the penny universities of London and the literary salons of Paris, through Brazilian fazendas and Colombian mountain farms and Vietnamese hillsides and Finnish kitchens and Viennese marble-topped cafe tables. You have followed a seed from a forest tree through the hands of pickers and processors and traders and roasters and baristas to the cup that is, in some version, somewhere in your life right now. It has been a long journey, and we are nearly at its end, which feels like the right moment to slow down a little and let the story settle around you the way warmth settles into a cold room when someone finally lights the fire. Coffee is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful plants in the history of the human relationship with the botanical world. From a single highland forest in Ethiopia, Coffea arabica has spread to cultivation in over 70 countries across 4 continents, not through its own dispersal mechanisms because the coffee plant has none suited to long-distance migration, but entirely through the agency of human desire. Humans carried it across the Red Sea, over mountain passes, through trade networks and colonial systems and acts of botanical espionage and romantic seduction until it was growing in every suitable climate on Earth. The plant did not seek this outcome. It simply produced a seed with extraordinary chemical properties, and the rest was human history. The scale of the current coffee economy is almost impossible to fully absorb. Approximately 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed every day on this planet, a number so large that it defeats the imagination's ability to hold it as a concrete quantity and can only be appreciated statistically. The global coffee industry generates revenues of approximately 400 billion US dollars per year in retail value, making it one of the largest food and beverage markets in the world. Coffee is the second most traded commodity globally by value after crude oil, a fact that surprises most people when they first encounter it, because coffee is so domestically familiar that its global commercial scale is invisible in the daily ritual of the morning cup. The industry employs, directly and indirectly, approximately 125 million people worldwide, with the majority of them in producing countries where coffee farming is the primary livelihood for entire communities. The gap between that $400 billion retail economy and the economic reality of the people at the producing end of the supply chain is one of the industry's most persistent and most uncomfortable facts. The International Coffee Organization estimates that coffee-producing countries collectively receive approximately $20 to $25 billion of that $400 billion total. Roughly 5 to 6 cents of every dollar the consumer spends reaches the producing country as a whole, and a fraction of that reaches the individual farmer. A smallholder coffee farmer in Ethiopia, growing 2 or 3 acres of coffee, harvesting and processing the cherries by hand, selling through a local cooperative, might receive a net income of several hundred to a few $1,000s per year from their coffee, while the retail chain that terminates in a $5 latte in a city cafe somewhere captures the vast majority of the value created. At every step of the journey, from cherry to cup. This structural imbalance has been a feature of the global coffee economy since the European colonial period established the supply chain architecture that still largely governs it, and it persists for reasons that are simultaneously systemic and tractable, not inevitable features of nature, but the results of decisions made and maintained by the industry, the financial system, and the trade policies of consuming countries. The decision to import unroasted green coffee rather than roasted or finished coffee, which is the norm for most global trade, ensures that the value-adding step of roasting happens in the consuming country rather than the producing one, keeping the economic benefit of that process within wealthy economies. The practice of trading coffee as a futures commodity subject to speculative price volatility rather than as a finished agricultural product with cost of production pricing reflects the power of commodity trading interests rather than the welfare interests of producers. These arrangements are not laws of physics. They are institutional choices, and they can be changed. The question of who changes them and how is one that the coffee industry has been engaged with at varying levels of seriousness for the past 30 years. Consumer awareness campaigns, the kind that put producer faces and stories on coffee packaging, have had some effect in creating willingness to pay premiums, but the premium is only meaningful if it reaches the producer rather than being captured at intermediate points in the supply chain. Certification systems have created infrastructure for tracking premiums to their intended destinations, but monitoring and enforcement are imperfect. Direct trade creates genuine relationships but reaches a small fraction of global production. Policy change at the level of trade agreements and commodity market regulation would be the most structurally significant intervention, but trade policy is the province of governments that have historically been more responsive to the interests of importing companies than producing country farmers. There are reasons for cautious optimism alongside the structural frustrations. The specialty coffee movement has unquestionably raised awareness of coffee as an agricultural product with specific origins, specific producers, and specific supply chains in ways that have made at least some consumers more curious about where their coffee comes from and more willing to pay prices that allow the producing end of the chain to operate with dignity. Producer organizations in Ethiopia, Colombia, Kenya, and other origins have developed increasing sophistication in marketing their coffees directly to international buyers, bypassing some of the intermediate trading layers. Producing countries including Ethiopia have worked to establish domestic roasting industries that capture more value from their own coffee before export. And the growth of domestic coffee consumption in producing countries. Brazil is now the world's second largest coffee consumer by total volume, and domestic consumption in Ethiopia, Colombia, and Vietnam is growing rapidly. Reduces dependency on export income and creates local markets that producers can supply without navigating international trade barriers. The environmental story and the equity story of coffee are increasingly understood as connected rather than parallel, that sustainable farming practices, adequate farmer incomes, and long-term ecosystem health are not separate objectives to be balanced against each other, but mutually reinforcing components of the same underlying challenge of building a coffee industry that can exist in 50 years in something like its current form. A farmer who cannot afford to maintain their farm cannot invest in shade trees or composting or water conservation. A farm that is degrading its own soil and water supply cannot maintain quality over time. A global industry that systematically underpays its producers is generating the conditions for the collapse of the supply it depends on, in the same way that any extractive system eventually exhausts its own foundation. The coffee plant itself participates in this dynamic in ways that are only recently being fully appreciated. Research into the microbiome of coffee-growing soils, the communities of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that inhabit healthy agricultural soils and drive the nutrient cycles that plant health depends on, has revealed that the specific microbial communities under well-managed shade-grown coffee farms are substantially more diverse and functional than those under intensive monoculture systems, and that this microbial diversity is directly linked to the chemical complexity of the coffee produced above it. The flavor in the cup is, in some measurable sense, a product of the ecological health of the soil far below, a chain of connection that runs from the invisible world of soil bacteria through the root system of the coffee plant, through the development of the cherry, through the extraction chemistry of the brewing process, to the aromatic compounds that reach your nose. Every dimension of the production system is connected to every other. This is perhaps the most important insight that the specialty coffee world has developed in its pursuit of quality, that you cannot separate the cup from the farm from the ecosystem from the climate from the decisions made by people in cities and governments and boardrooms who may never drink a cup of coffee in a context where its origin is visible. The cup is a summary, and like all summaries, it contains everything that produced it, the good and the difficult, and the unresolved and the beautiful, compressed into something warm enough to hold in your hands on a cold morning. The warmth is real. The history behind it is real. The people who grew it are real, and their circumstances are real, and the drink that resulted from all of it is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things the human species has found, cultivated, processed, roasted, ground, brewed, and consumed in its long and frequently remarkable history on this planet. We are almost at the end. One more section remains, and it is a quiet one. The light is low now. Whatever time it is where you are, and I hope you have told me, somewhere in the comments below, because those notes from around the world genuinely matter to me. The day is either behind you or has not yet begun, and either way, this is the right moment for the last part of the story. The part where we come back to the beginning, not because the story is circular exactly, but because all good journeys eventually bring you somewhere that makes the starting point visible from a new angle, and you see it differently than you did before you left. We began in an Ethiopian forest. We end, as most stories about pleasurable things end, in the act of consumption itself. The final ceremony, wherever you perform it, whatever version of it you have made your own. The kitchen at 6 a.m. with the house still silent. The cafe table by the window, with the street outside not yet fully awake. The office break room where the machine is slightly too loud and the coffee is slightly too bitter, and you drink it anyway because it is there and it is warm, and the morning requires fuel. The slow Sunday pour over, water in a thin stream from a gooseneck kettle, the bloom rising from the grounds in a dark, fragrant dome that smells like everything the week did not allow you time to appreciate. Coffee has found a way into every version of the human day, every class, every culture, every climate. The Finn drinking their fourth black filter coffee at 11 a.m, legal break observed, the winter outside pressing against the window. The elderly Italian gentleman standing at a zinc bar in a neighborhood cafe that has not changed its decor since 1967, tipping a small espresso into himself in 45 seconds without ceremony, leaving the exact change, departing. The Vietnamese student at a pavement cafe in Hanoi, Condensed milk pooling into iced coffee in a slow, sweet cloud, laptop open, fan turning overhead in the afternoon heat. The Ethiopian woman in Addis Ababa grinding beans by hand in a wooden mortar, the rhythm of the pestle, a sound her grandmother's grandmother would recognize. The Yemeni farmer in the mountain terrace, looking at his drying beds in the morning light, calculating the week's weather with the specific anxiety of someone whose livelihood depends on the sun staying reliable. All of them are participants in the same long story, and none of them needs to know the full length of it to participate meaningfully in their particular chapter. The story does not require your awareness to be true. The coffee does not require your knowledge of its history to be good. But knowing the history, the dancing goats and the Sufi monasteries, and the Ottoman coffeehouses and the penny universities and de Clieu nursing his seedling across the Atlantic and Paleta's bouquet of flowers hiding their revolutionary cargo, does something to the experience of the cup that is difficult to name and easy to feel. It makes it larger. It situates you in time, which is a comfort that stories have always provided, and that we return to them to receive. The Coffea arabica plant is approximately 10,000 years old as a species. That is, approximately 10,000 years have passed since it diverged from its ancestral Coffea canephora stock in the Ethiopian highlands, developing the genetic characteristics that distinguish it and that give its seeds their remarkable flavor potential. 10,000 years of evolution, undisturbed in the highland forest, before the first human being tasted a cherry and noticed something unusual. 1,000 years, roughly, since the tradition of brewing the seeds as a beverage began. 500 years since coffee reached Europe. 300 years since it became a genuinely global crop. 200 years since the modern commodity trade took shape. 50 years since the specialty movement began questioning whether commodity was the right frame for something this complex and this various. 20 years since that questioning began producing real changes in how the best coffee is grown, traded, and understood. The history of coffee is a history of acceleration. Each phase shorter than the last, each transformation more rapid, the pace of change increasing even as the underlying plant and its chemistry remain essentially what they have always been. The green bean in the Sufi monk's hand and the green bean in the specialty roaster's sample tray are chemically and genetically the same object. What has changed is everything around it. The scale of production, the complexity of the supply chain, the sophistication of the processing and roasting, the scientific understanding of what is happening at each stage, the awareness of the ecological and human costs of production, and the expectations of the people doing the drinking. The bean has been patient. The world around it has been very busy. Coffee leaf rust, the fungal pathogen that has been the industry's companion threat for a century and a half, was named Himalaya vastatrix, the devastating half-smooth, by the British mycologist Michael Joseph Berkeley in 1869, the year he first described it from specimens collected in Ceylon during the outbreak that would destroy the island's coffee industry and redirect it toward tea. The name is accurate in its Latin precision, half smooth in its spore structure, devastating in its effects. Berkeley was a Victorian gentleman scientist with a vicar's living and a passion for fungi so intense that he described approximately 6,000 new species during his lifetime. and the naming of the organism that would cause one of the most significant agricultural catastrophes in the history of a global commodity was, for him, a morning's work among many. He could not have known what he was naming. He knew only that it was new and that it needed a name, and that Latin was the appropriate language for the facts of the natural world. This small story, the Victorian mycologist naming the coffee disease in the year the Cuddy Sark was launched and the Suez Canal was opened, all in the same 12 months in which the modern world was taking shape with unusual clarity, contains in miniature something about the way history works. Everything happening at once, each event connected to the others in ways invisible at the time, the full picture assembling itself only from the long distance of retrospect. Coffee's history is like this throughout. The dancing goats and the Boston Tea Party and the Vienna Siege and the Brazilian bouquet and the Finnish labor law and the World Barista Championship all exist in the same long story, though the people living each moment could not see the others. You exist in this story too, in the most mundane and the most genuine way. Every cup you have ever drunk is part of it. Every morning ritual, every cafe table, every paper cup carried onto public transport, every terrible office coffee endured for the sake of sociability, every good cup that stopped you mid-sip and made you pay attention. All of these are your particular chapter, written in the same continuous narrative that began in a highland forest with a goat herd and his unusually energetic goats. The story is still going, the farms are still producing, the roasters are still developing profiles, the baristas are still perfecting their pours, the researchers are still working on the climate-resistant varieties that may determine whether the next generation of coffee drinkers has access to the quality that this one takes for granted. The farmers are still waking before dawn and going into the trees. The cherries are still ripening slowly in their own time, indifferent to everything except the conditions that make them possible. And somewhere in Ethiopia, in a forest that has been growing since before the concept of a farm existed, wild coffee trees are fruiting without witnesses, their red cherries hanging in the forest shade, chemistry intact, waiting for whatever comes next. That is where we began. That is, in the deepest sense, where everything still is. If tonight's journey gave you something, some warmth, some wonder, some new understanding of the drink that may be sitting beside you even now, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for keeping these stories going. And please do leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is there. Those comments are the modern coffee house. People from everywhere, gathering briefly around a shared story before returning to their own lives and their own mornings. Sleep well. The coffee will be there when you wake up. It always is. Good night,